Chapter 1. A Visitor in the Fog. It was upon a chill November evening, in the year of our Lord 1893, that the events I am about to relate first began to unfold. A night when London lay muffled in one of those thick yellow fogs that roll up from the Thames, blotting out the lamps along the embankment, and turning the gaslights of Baker Street into dim haloed orbs, adrift in a sea of murk. I had dined alone, for Holmes had been absent since mid-afternoon, pursuing, as I supposed, one of those small intellectual amusements which he so often indulged between cases, the tracing of some obscure German cipher, or the analysis of tobacco ash for his monograph, which by then had attained a near legendary status at Scotland Yard. I was sitting by the fire in our sitting room at 221B, a book upon my knee and my thoughts wandering back over certain former adventures, when the door burst open and my friend strode in, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light. His overcoat was damp from the mist, his eyes alight with that peculiar gleam which bespoke the excitement of an active case. "My dear Watson," he cried, flinging his gloves upon the table, "I trust your evening has not been altogether wasted in domestic tranquillity? We are to have a visitor presently, a client, if I do not mistake my reading of certain signs." I laid down my book, smiling at his abruptness. "A client, you say, at this hour?" Holmes sank into his armchair, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Indeed. A gentleman of middle years, well-to-do but profoundly agitated. His cab has just drawn up. The mud spattered upon the wheels and the driver's reluctance to wait speak to a journey of some distance. I would place his point of departure at least 4 miles to the south." "You have seen him, then?" "Only his reflection, my dear fellow," Holmes replied dryly, "in the glass of the tobacconist's window opposite. A tall man in a morning coat, his hat brim drawn low, but the sheen of black cloth, the fresh creases, and the pale gloves are unmistakable. He carries in his right hand a sealed envelope, and in his left— you shall see for yourself." As he spoke, there came a firm rap upon the door, and Mrs. Hudson's voice announced, "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes." "Show him up, if you please," said Holmes. A moment later our visitor entered, and seldom have I seen a man who bore upon his countenance a greater weight of sorrow. He was of spare frame, his features sharp and lined, his hair prematurely grey. The morning coat of which Holmes had spoken was indeed of fine cut, and the band of crape upon his arm declared recent bereavement. Yet it was not grief alone that haunted his eyes, but something deeper, fear, as of one pursued by an unseen hand. Holmes rose courteously. "Pray be seated, sir. You have come through no pleasant weather to reach us, I fear." The stranger inclined his head, removing his gloves with trembling fingers. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume, and Dr. Watson." "We are at your service," said I. "My name is Mr. Arthur Penhaligon," he began, "of Fetter Lane. I am, or was, senior clerk to the firm of Barrowby & Sons, importers of fine textiles. I come to you, sir, in the gravest distress. There has been a death, a strange and sudden death, and I am at my wits' end." Holmes regarded him keenly. "Pray compose yourself, Mr. Penhaligon. Begin at the beginning. Who is the deceased?" The man drew a long breath. "My employer, Mr. Jonas Barrowby. He was found dead this morning in his office. The police say it was apoplexy, brought on by excitement or exertion. But I know better." "Indeed." Holmes leaned forward. "You have reason to suspect foul play." "I have reason to know it," the man said solemnly, drawing from his pocket the sealed envelope Holmes had already described. "This arrived at my home at dawn. It bears no signature, yet it contains words that freeze the blood." Holmes took the envelope, examined the handwriting, and slit it neatly with his penknife. He unfolded the single sheet it contained, his eyes darting rapidly across the page. I saw his brows knit, then rise. "It reads," Holmes said quietly, "Tell no one. The man in the morning coat knows." For a moment there was silence save for the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Holmes turned the paper in his fingers. "Curious. Extremely curious. The note is written in a feminine hand, though somewhat disguised. The paper is of French manufacture, the watermark of Bignon Frères of Lyons, and the phrasing, "The man in the mourning coat," suggests that you are yourself under suspicion, Mr. Penhaligon. The clerk's face blanched. "That is what I fear, sir, for I was the last person to see Mr. Barrowby alive." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, then we have the first thread of our tapestry. You will oblige me by recounting every particular of yesterday's events." Penhaligon did so, his voice faltering only once. He had remained late at the office to balance certain accounts. At 9:30 he carried the ledgers into Mr. Barrowby's private chamber. The merchant appeared in good health, though somewhat irritable. They exchanged a few words, after which Penhaligon departed. The following morning the housekeeper found Barrowby slumped across his desk, his face discoloured, his hand still clutching a pen. "The constable said there were no marks of violence," Penhaligon continued, "but I noticed that the window was open, though it had been closed when I left. There was a faint smell, a bitter odour like almonds, and upon the blotter beside him lay a note, torn in half, bearing only the words, 'For God's sake, come at once,' and nothing more." Holmes had closed his eyes and now sat motionless, the fingertips of his right hand pressed together. "The odour of almonds," he murmured, "and the open window. Most suggestive, Watson." "Hydrocyanic acid," I said involuntarily. "But surely, Holmes, that would leave unmistakable traces." Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite so, my dear fellow. And yet our police friends have pronounced it apoplexy. That in itself is most illuminating." He rose and paced the room. "Mr. Penhaligon, you did wisely to come to me. There are elements here that do not accord with natural death. I shall visit Fetter Lane in the morning." The clerk looked up anxiously. "You believe, then, that Mr. Barrowby was murdered?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that he was assisted in leaving this world, whether willingly or no. The precise nature of that assistance remains to be determined." He tapped the cryptic letter upon the table. "And as for this, we must discover who knew of your mourning coat, and why it should serve as the symbol of menace. Until then, Mr. Penhaligon, you would do well to avoid solitary walks after dusk." The man started. "You think I am in danger?" "I think," Holmes replied evenly, "that the hand which slew your master may yet have work left unfinished." Watson's closing reflection. As our visitor departed into the swirling fog, Holmes stood long at the window, his lean figure etched against the faint glow of the gaslight. I heard him murmur half to himself, "The man in the mourning coat. Yes, Watson, a riddle in black cloth, and one that may yet lead us into dark company." Thus began one of the strangest and most perilous adventures in which I ever shared. An affair that tested Holmes's powers of deduction to their utmost, and brought us face to face with the shadow that walks unseen through respectable London. Chapter 2. The House in Fetter Lane. On the morning that followed Mr. Penhaligon's visit, I awoke to find the familiar comforting sounds of Baker Street already astir. The rattle of a coal scuttle upon the staircase, the distant clink of crockery from Mrs. Hudson's realm below, and in our sitting room the soft but purposeful movements of my friend, who was, as ever, earlier to his labours than the sun to its duties on a London November day. The fog of the previous night had thinned to a bluish veil, and the light such as it was, came slanting through the curtains in listless shafts. Holmes had cleared the table of our modest breakfast, and with his pipe thrust rakishly between his teeth, was bent over the writing desk by the window. A chemical spirit lamp burned there, and beside it a row of small glass phials, the odour of benzene mingled with a faint perfume which I presently identified as violet. On the blotter lay the anonymous note delivered to Mr. Penhaligon, now pinned at its corners upon a board and flanked by a magnifying lens and Holmes's well-worn pocket rule. "You perceive, Watson," said he without turning his head, "how poverty of light demands wealth of preparation. I have found it more efficient to force clarity than to wait upon it." "Then you have been experimenting upon Penhaligon's letter?" I asked, drawing up a chair. "Experimenting? Pooh! One does not experiment upon evidence any more than a surgeon plays at trepanning," he retorted, though there was mischief in his eye as he finally faced me. "No, I have confined myself to examination. Selective, discreet, and I trust illuminating." He indicated the pinned sheet. "Observe first the watermark. Bignon Frères of Lyons, as I remarked. The sheet is of high quality, intended for correspondence of some consequence. The cut of the paper suggests it was removed from a larger folio with a blade that has been used to open many letters. The faint burr along the lower edge tells us so. Whoever sent this note is no stranger to the post." "Your nose tells you as much as your eyes this morning," said I. "What is that perfume? You have drenched the room in it." Holmes lifted one corner of the paper. "Not I, Watson. The writer. A ghost of violets hovers on the fibers, discernible even after a night's journey. A lady's scent, yes, but not the cheap oils worn by milliners' girls on Sundays. This is the old preparation, bergamot at the top, orris as binder, worn by those with money or those who serve them. Now," he held the letter to the light. "Do you see at the extreme margin here? A sweep of color so faint it must be coaxed out by the eye?" I narrowed my gaze. "A dotting of gray. Or is it blue? Blue-gray, with a metallic sheen. That is powdered graphite, the dusty kiss a pencil leaves on the heel of the hand. Our correspondent writes often with a pencil, and I think with the left hand. The lower curve of the letter G here is thickened on the leftward stroke, and the tail of the Y has been smudged inward, not outward. A right-hander smudges away from the line, a left-hander across it." "It is remarkable," I cried, "how much you draw from so little." Holmes shrugged. "It is the fashion of the day to write at small desks and in confined offices. Left-handed writers who decline to conform leave a slug's trail in graphite across their work. I have an entire drawer of such trails, Watson." He fashioned a cigarette with his deft fingers and lit it at the spirit lamp. The flame threw up a brief flare that gilded his keen, ascetic face, and then sank to a steady glow. "Now," he continued, "we come to what is most curious. The phrase, 'the man in the mourning coat.' It is as though the writer, a woman left-handed, familiar with good paper, wished to proclaim knowledge of Mr. Penhaligon's attire without naming him. Why cloak the man and yet show the garment? Why not say, 'Mr. Penhaligon knows'? To shield him from immediate suspicion, I ventured, or to keep him under it without." "Naming him," Holmes countered. "If the police receive such a note, they look for a man in a mourning coat, and London wears half mourning every day. It is a phrase made to spread suspicion through the crowd like ink through water. Whoever wrote this is subtle. She directs attention without bearing the burden of specificity." He slid the note back into its envelope with the tender care of an antiquary returning a papyrus to its case. "There is something else. The gum of the envelope is a trifle granular. It leaves upon the tongue a suggestion of anise." "You tasted it?" I exclaimed. He smiled with his old impishness. "Only the smallest touch, my dear fellow. A continental gum base. The English maker prefers dextrine of a smoother sort. Whoever sealed this envelope did so with a stationer's gum not common in London's better houses, a French paper matched to a continental adhesive, a little inconsistency that would escape any but the fastidious." "Then Our Lady is French?" "Not at all. She lives within easy walk of a shop that imports such trifles as surely as Barrowby imported silks. But I grow long-winded. It is time we trod the cobbles." He donned his overcoat, and with hat tilted and cane in hand, descended the stairs at his whistling, light-footed pace. I followed with my old military cloak gathered close about me, for the damp insinuated itself like a thief under the door. A hansom stood at the curb, and soon we were rattling toward the city, the horse's breath smoking before it and the driver's whip making its neat arcs in the mist. Holmes, whose spirits rise with action as certainly as a barometer with fair weather, sat silent for a space, then began that playful display which he sometimes favoured when the case pressed upon his mind, as a fencing master will work an easy flourish to keep his wrist limber before the duel. "Watson," said he, peering through the trap of the cab at the pavement, "we shall reach Fetter Lane within the half-hour. Meanwhile let us amuse ourselves. What do you make of yonder gentleman with the sailor's jacket looped over his arm?" I craned my head past him. A stocky fellow in a coarse blue sweater and tar-stained cap was moving quickly along the sidewalk, a pipe clenched between his teeth. "A seafaring man," said I, "new ashore and in haste. Good as far as it goes." Holmes nodded. "But note the tiny length of green thread clinging to his elbow, a silk, no less, and the faint white crust upon his right boot which has lodged itself in the stitch. He has been in a warehouse where bales are opened and the floor sprinkled liberally with chloride of lime to discourage vermin. East India dock by the look of the fibre, that regular twist you see only from the Serampore looms. Moreover, his complexion, a shallow bronze with a lighter patch about the brow where a cap shades, declares the last fortnight spent in the teeth of a Levant sun. A short run, then, not a long voyage. And his haste? That comes of a shore leave near to its end. He hurries to Barclay's office to remit his pay before he is tempted to waste it at the Elephant and Castle." I laughed. "Your deductions are entertaining, Holmes, whether they strike or miss." "They strike," said he with dry certainty. "The Elephant and Castle keeps a tawny bull terrier. You may hear it even now. A sailor will not pass a dog he knows without stooping to clap it, and that man never deviated. He is racing his conscience rather than his watch." With that he relapsed again into thought, and we clattered on, past the yawning mouths of alleys and the lamp-lit windows of tea-rooms where early clerks warmed their hands. The city at that hour had not yet donned its full bustle, and so we made good time. The fog lay in stratified swaths, like a patchwork quilt flung hastily over London's shoulders. Here it brooded thick and greasy. There it lifted to show a lacework of chimney stacks, and the chalk-white face of a clock. Presently the cab drew up at the entrance to a narrow lane where the houses leaned toward each other, as if whispering gossip across the roadway. "Fetter Lane," announced Holmes, alighting. "Watson, if you would be so good as to note the ground as we go. A case is often won or lost in the first 10 yards. Barrowby and Sons occupied the second floor of a brick building whose ground store was let to a maker of surgical instruments. By an irony not lost upon me, a row of shining scalpels and forceps winked at us from behind the window glass as we mounted the stairs. A faint odor of oil, iron, and old cloth pervaded the narrow passage. At the top we found a modest brass plate, Barrowby and Sons, importers of silks, muslins, and fine textiles. The door stood closed, with a ragged strip of official red sealing tape across the jamb. Holmes knelt, studied the edges of the seal, and rose again with a grunt. "Broken and resealed," he murmured. "No doubt by our friends of the yard. We shall soon have their company." He tapped lightly. A bolt slid, and the door opened upon a pale woman with severe features and a black shawl about her shoulders. "I am Mrs. Dunn, the housekeeper." Her voice held that blend of deference and grievance peculiar to servants guarding a territory not quite theirs. "Are you from the police, sir?" "From Scotland Yard's less official flank," Holmes returned, showing his card. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. We come at the request of Mr. Penhaligon." At the name she startled. "Mr. Penhaligon. Then, sir, you will tell him from me that it is not right. Not right at all's the way folk look at a body who has given 20 years to a house. As if I would harm a hair of poor Mr. Barrowby's head. Bless him, though he could be a hard man at wages." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Who looks askance at you, Mrs. Dunn?" "The porter from the corner, sir, for one, and that meddling constable for another. Because I found him. Because I screamed. What else should a woman do?" "You shall tell me all in good time," said Holmes gently. "For the present, may we see Mr. Barrowby's room?" She drew the bolt and let us pass into a small entrance office containing 2 desks, a copying press, and tall presses of ledgers. Beyond, a door stood ajar upon a larger chamber whose tall window gave a watery light. Even before we crossed the threshold, I was aware that peculiar bitterness upon the air which, once smelled, is never forgot. Holmes's nostrils flared. "Almonds," he said softly, "and not the sugared sort." He stepped lightly across the floor. his gaze taking in details with a speed that belied its care. The window was raised 2 inches. Upon the sill, faint and friable as breath, lay a crescent of soot disturbed by the sash, and upon that soot a delicate, almost mathematical impression, as of woven threads pressed briefly and lifted. Holmes had out his lens in an instant. A grill of fine weave, he mused, either a veil or a curtain drawn tight. And see here, the merest sparkle along the edge. That is mica dust. Where do we find mica in such quantity? In certain packing compounds and in scouring powders used to polish glass. He passed to the desk. A heavy oak piece faced the window, a blotter upon it and a steel pen lying to the right. The chair had been thrust back askew, as though abandoned in a hurry. There was a darkened stain at one corner of the blotter. Holmes touched it with a glass rod and sniffed. Not blood, he said. Ink with a trace of phenol, the new disinfecting fluid the city clerks are so proud to splash about. Mr. Barrowby had a care for cleanliness, or someone wished us to think so. My medical instincts, balked of any patient to minister to, busied themselves in formal detail. I noted the blueness about the lips of the corpse as described to us, though the body itself had of course been removed. I examined the waste paper basket, which contained a crumpled sheet smudged with figures, and the half of a note bearing the imploring words Mr. Penhaligon had reported. For God's sake, come at once, and nothing beyond. Who tore this? I asked the housekeeper. It was as you see, sir, when the constable looked, said Mrs. Dunn, twisting her shawl in her fingers. I never touch what is not mine. Holmes had moved to the wall opposite the desk, where a narrow hearth supported a small coal fire, boxed in by an iron fender. He knelt, stirred the ash gently, and deftly withdrew with tweezers a blackened fragment, no larger than a sixpence. He laid it upon the window-sill and breathed upon it, until the grey gave way here and there to a speck of red. A stamp, he pronounced. Government issue, 4pence. What business had a stamp to burn in Mr. Barrowby's grate? One burns. Letters, not stamps. Unless one wishes to unstick a stamp to read beneath it, I said, struck by the thought. Holmes's eye twinkled. Bravo, Watson. An old trick among the less scrupulous clerks. And yet our stamp shows fire, not steam. Haste or clumsiness. I shall keep this. We were thus engaged when a brisk tread sounded in the outer office, and a thin, eager voice called, So, there you are, Mr. Holmes. I thought as much. Inspector Lestrade, for it was he, entered with his customary air of cocksure discomfort. His small, ferret-like eyes took in the scene. His glance rested an instant upon the window, then upon the hearth, and finally, with a mixture of amusement and annoyance, upon Holmes. I had the honour to leave this office last evening, he observed, and to seal it with my own hand. If you have come to assist, Mr. Holmes, I shall be obliged, but if you have come to mislead, I shall be doubly obliged. To show you out. Holmes bowed. My dear Lestrade, I congratulate you on your diligence. It is only a pity that your seal was broken and reset with so firm a hand that it made no secret of the operation. But pray, do not let me distract you. Dr. Watson and I shall keep to the corners. What is your view? Lestrade folded his arms. We have a death consistent with apoplexy, and a room empty of mischief. There is a foolish note on the blotter which any hysteric might have written in a panic, and there is a clerk, Mr. Penhaligon, who has been in and out at odd hours. He will oblige us at the Yard this afternoon. On what pretext? Holmes asked mildly. Lestrade's face sharpened. On the pretext, Mr. Holmes, that a man who appears in a mourning coat the very week his master dies has either a taste for ill-timed fashion, or advanced knowledge of bereavement. Mrs. Dunn gasped. Sir, Mr. Penhaligon's brother died at Michaelmas. He has worn black these 6 weeks. Lestrade coloured, but recovered. Then we will not hang him for his tailor, Mrs. Dunn. We shall, however, ask him why he was seen near the warehouse after midnight by the porter of Hobbs Yard, and why the window was found open in the morning. A draught would be enough to strike down a man of Mr. Barrowby's years, if he were soft to the chest. Holmes's lip curved, but he said nothing. He paced once about the desk, very lightly, treading only where the boards were already scuffed by daily use, and paused at the window. With his lens he surveyed the interior sash, then the brass latch, upon which to my eye there was nothing but the ordinary dulling of many hands. He straightened. A serviceable narrative, Lestrade, yet your apoplexy will have to explain away the odor which even your policeman must have noticed. Lestrade sniffed. Bitter almond? The doctor on duty says it proves nothing. 1,000 things smell so. We shall wait for the chemist's report. He moved to the waste paper basket, plucked out the torn plea, and slipped it into an envelope. And we shall have this, if you please. Holmes inclined his head with an air of submission that I, who knew him, recognized as a courtesy only. By all means. There is, however, one small request I must make in return. Let no one touch the sill of that window, nor the latch, until I have taken a wax impression. Lestrade, to my surprise, nodded. Be quick about it. I am not unreasonable, Mr. Holmes. If there is a print to be had, I will have it. Holmes took from his pocket a tiny case, warmed a sliver of wax, and in a moment had transferred to it the merest ghost of a mark from the inside of the latch. He held it to the light with the air of a jeweller appraising a flawed gem. Not a finger, he murmured. The whorl is continuous, but very fine. A glove, then, of kid or silk. And the impression lies at a curious angle, as if the hand that made it had to reach in from the outside with the left hand. You see, Watson, the tilt. Our window was opened, not to air the room, but to admit a hand that dared not turn the latch from within. Lestrade's eyebrows rose despite himself. A burglar, then? A visitor, Holmes said. One who knew precisely where the latch lay and did not wish to be seen to open it. A lady's hand, perhaps. A left-handed lady with the habit of violet scent. But I build too fast. The truth will abide our patience. He closed his case. Mrs. Dunn, I shall trouble you with a question or two. Who had access to Mr. Barrowby's private chamber? Only Mr. Barrowby, sir, and Mr. Penhaligon when he brought the ledgers. There is Mr. Barrowby's nephew, Mr. Raymond. He comes and goes. And Miss Lydia, Mr. Barrowby's ward. She sews samples and writes the letters when Mr. Penhaligon is at the counting desk. Holmes was very still. Miss Lydia? A sweet-tempered young lady, sir, though proud-like. Been with Mr. Barrowby since she was a child after her mother died. The housekeeper hesitated, glancing toward Lestrade. She wore mourning this past week, too, though for whom I cannot say. Only a band upon her arm. She had the key to the stationery cupboard yonder. Holmes's eyes flicked once, to the cupboard, to the desk, and then to the window-sill with its delicate imprint of woven threads and mica dust. He bent, looked again, and then straightened, his ascetic face thoughtful. Thank you, Mrs. Dunn. You have been of service. Inspector, I shall not hamper your admirable energy, but I confess I am curious to pay a call upon Mr. Raymond Barrowby and Miss Lydia, in whatever order chance permits. Lestrade tucked the envelope into his pocket. You will do as you please, Mr. Holmes. Only do not carry your theories to the newspapers before I have my man. My dear Lestrade, said Holmes mildly, I have no theory, only data. When I have a theory, I shall try it first upon Watson. He bears these assaults with equanimity. Because they are usually victorious, I returned. We took our leave, promising Mrs. Dunn we would speak again. In the stairwell, Holmes paused, stooped, and touched the topmost step with his finger. He showed me a grit upon it, a bright speck that glittered against the skin. Mica, he said. It travels. From the sill. From the person who leaned upon the sill to reach the latch, a person who had recently handled glass or scouring powder, and who wore at the elbow a fabric woven on a fine grill, a veil perhaps drawn close, which would press the pattern lightly into soot when the wearer steadied herself against the window. Herself, I repeated. The angle of the impression, the height upon the sash, and the mere practical matter of a lady's veil and scent, he returned. But I do not marry my fancies. Come, Watson, Fetter Lane keeps its people in nearby rookeries and respectable courts alike. We shall make inquiries as we go." Outside, the fog had thinned to a dingy gauze, and the clatter of traffic was at last in full cry. We walked a little way up the lane and paused before a narrow, cleanly house with a polished knocker, upon which a small brass nameplate read, "Raymond Barrowby." The blinds were half drawn. A maid of sullen aspect informed us that Mr. Raymond had gone out on family business, and would not return until afternoon. Holmes left a card. From thence we turned our steps along a street of small shops. At the corner, a stationer's presented a prim display of foreign papers and coloured inks. Holmes entered, and I followed. A bell tinkled. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a narrow face and a look of bleached patience. "Sir," said Holmes with the air of an ordinary customer, "I am in need of French notepaper, Lyons manufacture, Bignon Frere if you have it, and envelopes to match, also a gum for sealing which has a clean taste and dries quickly." The man produced a packet at once. "We keep Bignon, yes, and we import a gum from Antwerp favoured by our ladies who do much correspondence. It is scented very faintly. Would this serve?" Holmes's eyebrows lifted as he sampled it on the tip of his finger. "Admirably. Pray tell me, do you supply many offices?" "A few in this lane," said the man. "Barrowby's clerks sometimes come for their stamps, though they mostly use the city requisitions. Any particular lady favour your notepaper?" The stationer smiled with a practised discretion. "Ladies favour many things, sir." Holmes laughed. "Quite right. One last trifle. Do you carry scouring powder for glass?" The man shook his head. "Not we, sir. Try Mr. Hobbs' yard. The porter keeps a variety of such nostrums for the windows. The mica dust, they call it, from a supplier up Aldersgate." Holmes thanked him and paid for the paper and gum, which he tucked into his pocket with an air of casualness that deceived no one. In the street once more, he looked at me sidelong. "You see the circle tightening, Watson. A French paper and an Antwerp gum to be had within 50 yards of the dead man's desk. A window polished with mica-dusted powder by a porter who traffics in it. A left-handed lady who writes fair and carries violets, whose veil brushed soot upon a sill. And the man in the mourning coat. A phrase turned to sow confusion. All this. And yet I tell you, we stand not at the threshold, but in the vestibule only." "Then your mind is not made up?" I asked. "My mind," said Holmes, "is a housekeeper who refuses to lay the breakfast until the whole company is present. I am waiting upon Miss Lydia." We had not gone far before he halted abruptly and turned me into the shadow of a doorway. "There," he whispered, "at the opposite corner. That young woman with the modest bonnet and the band of crape upon her sleeve. Do you observe how she stops at each shop where letter paper is displayed and glances at the racks, not to buy, but to not buy? That is the look of a conscience taking inventory. Come, Watson." Softly. We followed at a discreet distance. The young woman paused outside the very stationer's we had lately left. She half extended a gloved hand to the latch, drew it back, then with a small shudder as if in revolt against herself, turned away and passed on. Her face, when she lifted it, was pale but composed, and there was about her that air which tells of gentle birth under straitened circumstances, neatness without extravagance, pride without ornament. As she crossed a brighter patch of pavement, I caught the touch of a scent. Holmes's nostrils quivered. "Violets," he murmured. "And she keeps her pen in her left glove finger. See the tiny stain upon the kid. That, Watson, is Miss Lydia. And if we do not learn truth from her, we shall at least learn courage." He stepped forward with that grave courtesy which he can assume at will, and lifted his hat. "Pray pardon me, miss. My name is Sherlock Holmes. I would have a word with you for your sake and for the sake of a gentleman lately deceased." She stopped as if a wire had tightened across her path, and for an instant I thought she would flee, but she did not. She looked at Holmes, then at me, and her chin lifted a little, as if she recognized a tribunal and would meet it standing. "Very well," she said. If you are Mr. Holmes, then I have been expecting you. Chapter 3. Miss Lydia's Confession. There was something so composed, almost resigned, in the young woman's manner that for a moment Holmes himself seemed taken aback. He regarded her keenly with that piercing gaze which seemed to read the very pulse of a person's soul, while I stood slightly aside, taking in her appearance with the trained eye of both observer and physician. She could not have been more than 26, tall, graceful, and with that peculiar refinement which betrays gentle birth. Her dress, though plain, was of good material, and the black band upon her sleeve was neatly pressed, the sort of small care that betrays habits of order even in distress. But what struck me most was the expression of her eyes, grey, luminous, and shadowed by something far deeper than fear. It was as if she carried a secret whose weight she had long since accepted, and now waited only for its revelation to destroy or deliver her. Holmes raised his hat once more. "You are Miss Lydia Barrowby, I presume?" "Yes," she replied quietly. "And you are Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had heard your name from my uncle once. He said you were a man to be avoided by those who valued their secrets." Holmes smiled faintly. "A compliment, though not one that guarantees affection. May I beg that we speak privately? I have rooms in Baker Street, but perhaps a quieter corner nearby might serve." She hesitated a moment, glancing down the fog-veiled street. "There is a tea-room near the Holborn end, if you will promise that what I tell you harms no innocent person." "I will speak." "I promise," said Holmes simply. "Come, Watson." We walked in silence, save for the rhythmic clatter of carriage wheels and the distant bark of a newspaper boy crying the morning edition. The young woman led us to a narrow establishment tucked between a bookseller's and a print shop. Within, the air was warm and scented faintly with bergamot. A solitary waiter, grey-haired and discreet, ushered us to a corner table. When tea had been served and we were alone, Holmes folded his hands and leaned slightly forward. "Now, Miss Barrowby," he said, "I must ask you to trust me entirely. The truth, the whole of it, and I shall know if you spare me any part." She gave a small, weary smile. "I have no strength left for deceit, Mr. Holmes. You wish to know of my uncle's death. I will tell you what I can, though it may not please you." Holmes inclined his head. "Then begin with this morning, if you please, when you first heard of it." "I did not hear of it," she said softly. "I saw it. I was in the room." I felt Holmes stiffen beside me. "Indeed, go on." She clasped her hands upon her lap, the knuckles white with the strain. "I had remained late the previous night, finishing the accounts my uncle had pressed upon me. He was often stern, hard even, but never cruel. That night, however, he was unlike himself, restless, pacing and muttering of a man who had deceived him. I thought it was Mr. Penhaligon he referred to, for they had quarrelled 2 days prior about some missing invoices. When at last he dismissed me, I lingered to tidy the shelves. I heard him bolt the door behind me." She paused, her breath shallow. "Then perhaps 20 minutes later I realized I had left my cloak upon a peg, within. The air was chill and I returned for it. The office was dark but for a glimmer through the keyhole. I knocked. There was no reply. I turned the latch. The door yielded. She looked down into her teacup. He was at his desk, his head upon his arm as if in sleep. I spoke. He did not move. I went closer. His lips were blue, his skin cold. I saw the paper, that half-written message. I screamed, I think. After that I remember only confusion, the housekeeper's voice, the constable, the doctor. Holmes, who had listened in perfect stillness, now asked in the gentlest tone, "You told no one of having returned after you were dismissed?" She shook her head. "I feared. I scarcely know what I feared. I thought they would accuse me of entering unbidden. And when the police began to whisper of poison, I dared not speak at all. Then this morning I found this in my letter-box." From her reticule she drew a folded slip of paper, the twin of that shown to us by Mr. Penhaligon. Holmes took it delicately, opened it, and read aloud, Tell him nothing. The Mourning Coat sees all." For a moment Holmes's face darkened. Then he laid the note upon the tablecloth and looked straight into the young woman's eyes. "You have done wisely to show me this. Tell me, do you know anyone who uses violet perfume?" Her gaze wavered. "Yes," she whispered. "Myself." Holmes's eyebrows lifted, but he said nothing. He merely tapped the paper once thoughtfully, with his long finger. "Then, Miss Barrowby," said he at last, "there is one point more. You mentioned your uncle spoke of a man who had deceived him. Was it Mr. Penhaligon?" "I thought so," she said, "but now I am less sure. There was another name I heard. Raymond. Your cousin." "Yes, he is my uncle's nephew by his brother's side. My uncle often scolded him for his debts. But the night before his death he said something strange, that Raymond had been bought and sold. I asked what he meant, but he would not answer." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "And your cousin, how did he bear the news?" "Coldly," she replied with a shiver. "Too coldly. He spoke of inheritance and the firm's future before my uncle was cold in his chair. He told me to burn certain papers, and when I refused he grew pale with anger." "Did you burn them?" "No, I hid them beneath the false bottom of my sewing box." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then you must show them to me this evening." She hesitated. "If I do, will you promise not to betray anyone until you know the truth?" "On my honor," said Holmes. There was a silence. Then she rose, drawing her cloak about her shoulders. "Come to my lodging at 8:30, then. It is in Brook Street, above a dressmaker's. Ask for Miss Lydia Barrowby. And Mr. Holmes, if I am not there when you arrive, wait, for it will mean I have gone where only truth can follow." Before we could speak, she was gone, leaving behind the faint fragrance of violets, the echo of her soft step, and upon the table that ominous second note. Holmes sat back, staring at it for a long while. At last he said, "Watson, do you perceive the artistry? The same paper, the same hand, and yet the pronoun altered. Tell no one becomes tell him nothing. It is the work of a mind that observes and plays. We have entered a contest with wit itself." "And the Mourning Coat?" I asked. "Twice mentioned, first of Penhaligon, now as a watcher. It cannot be mere coincidence." "Quite so. A phrase repeated becomes a pattern, but whether our adversary uses it as weapon or mask remains to be seen." He folded both notes carefully and placed them within his case. "This evening we call upon Miss Lydia, and if my instincts serve me, we shall find more there than papers and perfume." He rose, drawing on his gloves. "Come, Watson. Until then I have an errand in Aldersgate, concerning mica dust, glass polishers, and a porter who may have seen the face of the man who leans from windows." As we stepped once more into the cold London air, I could not shake from my mind the image of the girl's pale face, her quiet despair, and that haunting line, "The Mourning Coat sees all." It seemed less a warning than a prophecy. Chapter 4. The Papers in the Sewing Box. Evening had already descended upon London when Holmes and I set out for Brook Street, our hansom rattling through the damp labyrinth of the West End. The fog of the morning had thickened once more into a low yellow miasma that swirled beneath the lamps and made of every crossing a place of shadows. There is, I think, no mood so suited to the beginning of strange adventures as that of a London fog. It muffles the familiar, silences the routine, and gives to the most ordinary errand the air of conspiracy. Holmes, for his part, was in one of his most intense moods of abstraction. For half the journey he neither spoke nor stirred, his head bowed, his eyes fixed upon some inner point of reflection. At last, as we turned into Holborn, he roused himself and spoke. "Watson," said he, "have you ever observed how seldom men act according to the logic they profess, and how often women act according to the logic they feel?" "I cannot say that I have framed it quite in those terms," I answered cautiously. He smiled. "Yet it is precisely that distinction upon which this case hinges. Miss Lydia feels herself to be in peril, and therefore acts with truth. even when her words evade it. Mr. Penhaligon, on the other hand, professes honesty, but his actions betray a hesitation that does not spring from guilt, but from fear. Fear of what? We have yet to learn. You believe her story, then? To believe is a luxury I rarely indulge. I test. Tonight's experiment will be a simple one. If Miss Lydia possesses those papers, we shall see whether they confirm her uncle's talk of betrayal, and whether they bear the mark of another hand. The cab drew up before a narrow house wedged between a tobacconist's and a stationer's. A single lamp glimmered in the upper window. Holmes paid the driver, and we ascended the worn steps. A signboard near the bell proclaimed, "Miss Darrow, Dressmaker." Holmes pressed the button. The faint clang within was answered by a light tread, and the door opened. A girl of 15 or 16, slight, dark-eyed, and with a pin-cushion fastened to her wrist, stood before us. "Miss Barrowby?" Holmes asked. "She is upstairs, sir," said the girl. "Will you come in?" We followed her up a narrow flight of stairs to a sitting-room modestly furnished but scrupulously neat. A lamp burned upon a small round table. Beside it a pot of violets gave out the same faint fragrance I had already come to associate with Miss Lydia, yet the lady herself was not there. Holmes took in the room with one rapid sweep of his eyes. "She expected us," he murmured. "The tea is laid for 3, but she has been gone. Let us see, 40 minutes perhaps." "How can you tell?" I asked. He pointed to the teapot. "The steam ceased to rise long ago, and yet the surface is still warm to the touch. The window stands ajar. She went out, not to receive air, but to observe. Note how the curtain cord is looped, drawn hastily back, then dropped. And see, upon the hearthrug, that small spatter of wet mud." I stooped. It was as he said, the impression of a boot heel, small but firm. "A woman's size." Holmes nodded. "Miss Lydia wears narrow boots with a slightly turned heel. You can see the same shape in her step along Fetter Lane this morning. She left here hurriedly, to meet someone, or to escape someone." The dressmaker's assistant had been watching us nervously. "Miss Lydia had a visitor this evening, sir," she said at last. "A gentleman." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "Describe him, if you please." The girl frowned in thought. Tall, pale, very well dressed. He spoke low, and he seemed angry, sir. Not shouting, but like when a kettle boils before it whistles. "Miss Lydia told me to go below, but I heard them through the floor. He said something about papers, and she said, 'You shall not have them while I live.'" "Indeed?" Holmes's eyes kindled. "And what then?" "He went out, sir. 10 minutes later she followed in her cloak." Holmes drew from his pocket the small card the maid had given him earlier that day. "Was this the man?" She peered at it. "Yes, sir. That's him, Mr. Raymond Barrowby." I felt a thrill of dismay. "Her cousin?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "A family conference in the fog. Never a cheerful omen. Watson, we must not linger. Miss Lydia may already be beyond our reach." He was halfway to the door when his eye fell upon a small lacquered sewing box upon the side table. He paused, then returned and lifted the lid. Inside lay the usual trifles of feminine work: reels of cotton, scissors, a thimble, and at the bottom a shallow tray lined with faded velvet. Holmes ran a finger around its edge, then with a delicate motion pressed at one corner. The tray lifted, revealing a narrow recess beneath. From it he drew a packet of folded papers tied with blue ribbon. "The lady's trust in you was well-founded," I said. Holmes's mouth twitched. "So far. Let us see what these contain." He carried the bundle to the lamp, untied the ribbon, and spread the contents upon the table. There were 4 documents, one a copy of a will, another a letter bearing the crest of Barrowby and Sons, and 2 sheets covered in figures and signatures. Holmes scanned them swiftly, his face growing graver with each line. "Watson, we stand upon treacherous ground. These are not merely business papers. This," he tapped the letter, "is from a firm in Lyons, addressed to Mr. Jonas Barrowby, demanding immediate payment for certain silks said to have been received and sold under his name. But the accompanying ledgers, see here, show no record of the transaction." Someone used the firm's credit to import goods privately. A fraud concealed within legitimate trade. Penhaligon, I suggested. Possibly. But mark this. The letter is dated the 12th, and signed by one Jean-Claude Maurice. Yet Barrowby's death occurred on the 15th. He had 3 days to act, or to confront the man who wronged him. Now observe the handwriting upon these 2 sheets of figures. It matches that of the anonymous note. The same leftward slant, the same looping G. Watson, our mysterious correspondent and the falsifier of these accounts are one and the same. I stared at him. Then Miss Lydia herself. He lifted a hand. Patience. The paper, remember, is of French make, common enough to her stationer. The notes may have been written in that hand precisely to mimic hers. We tread amid shadows, cast by mirrors. He gathered the papers and returned them to the box. We will take these to Baker Street. Their contents may decide whether Miss Lydia is victim or accomplice. As he spoke, there came from the street below a sudden sound, the slam of a door, the quick patter of running feet, and then a cry that rang sharp and dreadful through the night. Holmes was at the window in an instant, flinging it wide. There, Watson, at the corner. Through the shifting fog I caught a fleeting glimpse, a dark figure struggling with a smaller form, a woman's, by the railings near the curb. Then the 2 shapes broke apart. The woman stumbled, the other vanished into the mist, and a handom's wheels clattered off at full speed. We were down the stairs and into the street within half a minute. Miss Lydia lay upon the pavement, her cloak torn, her face ashen. I knelt beside her. Her eyes fluttered open. Mr. Holmes, she gasped faintly. He tried to take them. The papers, they are safe, said Holmes, bending over her. You have done bravely. Who was it? She shook her head. I could not see. He wore a hat pulled low. But his voice, it was not Raymond's. Then whose? Holmes pressed. Her lips moved. I leaned closer. The man in the mourning coat, she whispered and fainted. Holmes straightened slowly, his face set in iron calm. Watson, she must be taken home and cared for. I will send for a cab. The assailant has not gone far, but the fog will hide him before I can track his prints. Still, he has declared himself. He glanced up and down the deserted street. The man in the mourning coat moves at last. We shall see how far his mourning extends, to his conscience or only to his victims. That night, as I sat by Miss Lydia's bedside in her lodgings and Holmes worked silently beside the fire, examining the purloined papers beneath his glass, the phrase echoed in my mind again and again. The man in the mourning coat. It seemed no longer a figure of speech, but the shadow of death itself, moving unseen through the fog-bound streets of London. Chapter 5. The Hidden Ledger. It was near 1 o'clock in the morning when I returned from seeing Miss Lydia safely attended by the dressmaker's maid and a local physician. I found Holmes in the same attitude in which I had left him, seated by the fire at our Baker Street lodgings, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, the packet of papers spread upon the low table before him like the elements of a complex equation awaiting solution. The lamp threw its mellow light across the lean planes of his face, and caught upon the faint blue haze of tobacco smoke which hovered about his head like incense before an idol of reason. Without lifting his eyes, he spoke. Watson, you have been gone 48 minutes. The cabman who conveyed Miss Lydia has gone straight home to Tottenham Court Road, his horse lame in the near foreleg. You see, I am well informed. Holmes, said I, removing my coat, you would astonish the recording angel himself with the minuteness of your data. But pray tell me, have you learned anything of importance from those papers? He smiled faintly. Everything, and nothing. These sheets are a palimpsest of human weakness, Watson, greed, vanity, and the most dangerous of all errors, the belief that intellect alone can conceal its own misdeeds. He rose, crossed to the sideboard, and poured 2 measures of brandy. Observe, my dear fellow, how the ledgers, when examined by ordinary light, seem innocent enough, columns of figures, all neatly added, all reconciled. But under the blue lens of my magnifier, one perceives that certain numerals have been written twice, first in faded black ink, then retraced in blue. The earlier hand and the later differ by a subtle tremor. The signature of forgery. Then you mean that the accounts were tampered with after Mr. Barrowby's death? Holmes replied. The original entries, if my eye does not deceive me, would have exonerated Mr. Penhaligon entirely. The additions condemn him. I leaned over the papers, fascinated. By whom were they altered, then? Not Miss Lydia, surely. Miss Lydia's hand is too steady, her loops too delicate. Observe this clumsy imitation of feminine script. An effort to appear light, yet betraying a heavy wrist. A man's hand attempting a woman's disguise. There is only one person in this drama who fits that description. Raymond Barrowby, I murmured. Just so. A man in debt, facing exposure, and with an inheritance standing between him and ruin. Jonas Barrowby's death releases that inheritance, but only if the firm's reputation remains intact. The discovery of embezzlement would bring bankruptcy, investigation, and the loss of everything. Therefore he must both silence his uncle and shift the blame elsewhere. A neat solution, too neat perhaps for its author's safety. Holmes began to pace, his long shadow flickering across the ceiling. Yet there is still the hand behind the curtain, Watson. The unseen writer of those letters, the watcher in the fog, the man in the mourning coat. Who is he? Is he real, or a phantom devised to cloak another's guilt? He attacked Miss Lydia, I reminded him. That proves his existence. True, Holmes said quietly, but we must ask, why her? What had she done but hide papers already useless to him since we now possess them? No. He sought to frighten her, to silence her. And fear, my dear fellow, is the favorite tool of those who lack evidence but possess knowledge. The man in the mourning coat knows something, but not everything. He stopped suddenly before the fire and struck his hand upon the mantel. Watson, fetch your coat. We go to Fetter Lane. At this hour? At this hour precisely. The fog is our ally tonight. Lestrade's watchmen will have gone to their tea, and the offices will lie empty. I must examine the safe in Barrowby's chamber. I have reason to believe that the final piece of this puzzle lies within. I had long since ceased to argue with Holmes when his purpose burned in his eyes like that, and within 10 minutes we were once again clattering through the gaslit streets. The fog pressed against the cab's windows in clammy waves, and the driver's lanterns shone as dull globes in the murk. When at last we reached the warehouse, the street lay utterly deserted save for the distant creak of a night watchman's step and the low hum of the city beyond. Holmes produced a small key from his pocket. A duplicate of Mr. Penhaligon's, he explained. He lent it under the impression that I required it for analysis, so I do, though not quite in the manner he imagines. The lock yielded easily. We entered, our footfall sounding unnaturally loud in the hush. The scent of chemicals still hung faintly in the air, mingled with the stale odor of cloth and dust. Holmes struck a match, lit the lamp upon the clerk's desk, and moved straight to the inner office. The safe stood against the wall, a ponderous thing of black steel with gilt scrollwork about its dial. Holmes knelt before it, his eyes bright. A Chubb of the 91 pattern. A reliable fellow, but with a weakness. The lower catch, when filed, leaves a whisper of metal that can be felt but not seen. He produced a thin blade from his case and began to probe delicately at the edges of the dial. I confess I watched with mingled awe and anxiety as his fingers performed their delicate ballet. Then came a soft click, and the door swung open. Inside lay orderly stacks of papers, a ledger, and a small wooden box. Holmes drew the box forth first. It was of fine rosewood, its lid secured by a tiny brass lock already forced. Within lay a vial of colorless liquid, stoppered and wrapped in tissue. Holmes uncorked it cautiously, waved it beneath his nose, and recoiled. "Bitter almonds again," he said grimly. "Hydrocyanic acid, the very devil's essence. Look here, the vial is less than half full, and the neck bears traces of cotton fiber. Someone used a cloth to administer this, perhaps upon a pen or a handkerchief. The victim writes, wipes his brow, and dies within seconds. I shuddered. Good heavens, Holmes! You mean the poison was applied deliberately to an object he handled? Undoubtedly. The trick is old as the Borgias, yet effective still. He replaced the vial and drew out the ledger. Now for our hidden ledger. The volume was large, bound in worn calf, and filled with the dense hand of commercial accounts. Holmes turned the pages swiftly, his eye moving as though each line spoke aloud to him. Then, near the middle, he stopped and smiled. Huh. What have we here? He pointed to an entry written in red ink across the margin. Received. Private consignment from Lyons via Antwerp. Payment deferred. R.B. Holmes's finger tapped the initials. R.B. Watson. Not Raymond Barrowby. That would be too open. Yet who else signed so? And see the date. 3 days before the murder. The payment deferred. To whom? To Barrowby and Sons, or to the man who stole their name? He closed the book and looked at me keenly. This ledger was meant to vanish, and so it shall, from the hands of those who would destroy it. As he spoke, a sudden sound echoed from the stair below, the faint creak of a board, the brush of a boot. Holmes's hand shot up for silence. We listened. There it was again, a stealthy tread, ascending slowly toward us. Holmes moved like a cat. He doused the lamp, leaving only the faint gleam from the window. In the darkness I heard the whisper of his revolver leaving its case. The door handle turned softly. A shadow loomed against the fogged glass. Then the door swung inward, and a shaft of lantern light cut across the room. "Stand where you are!" Holmes's voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "Watson, the lamp!" I sprang forward and struck a match. The flame leapt up, and in its glow stood Inspector Lestrade, his face flushed and indignant. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he snapped, "so this is how you assist the law, breaking into sealed premises in the dead of night." Holmes lowered his revolver, quite unperturbed. "My dear Lestrade, you arrive in the very nick of time. I have something here which will greatly assist you, provided you can restrain your men from arresting me long enough to examine it." Lestrade's eyes fell upon the open safe, the ledger, and the vial. His expression shifted from irritation to curiosity. "What's all this?" Holmes handed him the book. "Proof of fraud, and motive for murder. But the poison, that, my dear Inspector, requires a subtler touch. Have it tasted, and you will find hydrocyanic acid of precisely the same composition as that used in a certain Lyonnais factory that trades with Barrowby and Sons." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "And who do you say is responsible?" Holmes smiled his thin, enigmatic smile. "I say nothing yet. But if you would care to accompany me tomorrow to the office of Mr. Raymond Barrowby, I fancy we shall find him less occupied with mourning than with his solicitor." Lestrade hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, but remember, the Yard has long arms, and I'll not have you taking matters out of them." As he departed, Holmes turned to me, the old gleam in his eye. "Watson, tomorrow will see the first mask fall, but I warn you, the true face beneath it may surprise us both." That night, long after Holmes had retired, I sat alone by the dying fire, the ledger open upon my knees. Outside, the fog pressed close against the windows, and somewhere far away a clock struck 3. The words, "The man in the mourning coat," echoed in my mind like the tolling of a bell. It seemed to me then that we were not merely pursuing a criminal, but following the shadow of death himself, and that before the case was done, that shadow might yet fall across us both. Sherlock Holmes and the man in the mourning coat. Chapter 6. The Second Death. The next morning broke dim and cold, with a rain that hung half frozen in the air like a mist of needles. London lay grey and glistening under its perpetual pall, and even the sparrows seemed subdued as they hopped along the dripping ledges outside our window. Holmes had been awake since dawn, though in truth I am unsure whether he had slept at all. When I came down, I found him before the fire, his violin upon his knee, his bow drawn slowly across, the strings in a long dissonant chord that trembled like the prelude to some grave revelation. Without ceasing his music, he spoke. "The tragedy of intellect, Watson," said he, "is that it leads us always toward isolation. Consider our murderer, if indeed we have one, who believes himself clever enough to conduct two crimes under the same cloak of deceit. But a mind that conceives of itself as unique always overplays its hand. It must show its superiority. It cannot resist the theatre of risk." I poured myself coffee and took my seat opposite him. "You are speaking of Raymond Barrowby?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Of someone, certainly. Whether that someone be Raymond Penhaligon or our spectral man in the mourning coat remains to be seen. But before nightfall one mask at least shall drop. We are invited, Watson, to a performance." He rose abruptly, set down the violin, and took from the mantel a note that had arrived by hand an hour earlier. He passed it to me without comment. "Mr. Holmes, your interference in matters concerning my late uncle has gone far enough. I invite you to attend at my chambers in King's Bench Walk at 2 o'clock this afternoon, where I shall produce evidence that will satisfy both the police and yourself. Raymond Barrowby." "An invitation," I murmured. "That sounds perilously like a challenge." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. And I am never one to decline a challenge." We arrived at King's Bench Walk a few minutes before the appointed hour. The rain had thickened, and the cobbles glistened like a mirror beneath our feet. Raymond Barrowby's chambers were upon the second floor of a narrow building overlooking the Inner Temple Gardens. A clerk, pale and nervous, admitted us, leading the way through a passage that smelt of damp parchment and ink. Holmes, as was his habit on such occasions, appeared listless and detached, as though the entire business were a matter of the smallest consequence. But I had learned long ago that beneath this languor lay a mind alert to every vibration of circumstance. He took in the disorder of the hallway, the faint ash smudge upon the clerk's sleeve, the umbrella stand with its single empty place, and said nothing. Raymond Barrowby was waiting for us in his sitting room. He was a tall man, handsome in a cold way, with a moustache of the military cut fashionable among the younger barristers, and an expression of perpetual calculation. The air of the room was heavy with cigar smoke. On the table before him lay a pile of documents tied with red tape, and beside them a revolver, carelessly half hidden under a newspaper. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a thin smile, "I thank you for your punctuality. You too, Doctor. I imagine you are here in your usual capacity, to witness the ruin of another of my uncle's family." Holmes inclined his head. "I am here, Mr. Barrowby, to witness the truth. Whether it ruin or redeem you, I cannot say." Barrowby's eyes flashed. "Then let us to it. You have, I understand, certain papers, stolen from my cousin Lydia's possession." "Recovered, Mr. Barrowby," Holmes corrected quietly. "Stolen is a term for which I might have equal cause to reproach others." The young man gave a short laugh. "A duel of words, then. Very well. You believe, I suppose, that my uncle's death was not natural." "I believe," said Holmes, "that he died of a poison which left the faint scent of bitter almonds." "That belief is shared, I think, by the coroner who examined him this morning." Barrowby started visibly. "The coroner?" "Lestrade moved swiftly," Holmes replied. "He had the body exhumed at dawn. The stomach contents revealed hydrocyanic acid, as I expected. You see, we are well past conjecture." The young man turned pale, then laughed again, more harshly than before. "Then you think I did this thing?" Holmes was silent a moment, regarding him with that piercing gaze which could unnerve the most hardened of men. Then he said softly, "I think, Mr. Barrowby, that you knew it would be done." Barrowby's hand moved involuntarily toward the revolver upon the table, but Holmes was before him. With a motion so swift I scarcely saw it, he swept the weapon up and placed it in his own pocket. "Come, come," said he with a touch of irony. "You invite me to conversation, not combat." Barrowby sank back into his chair, breathing heavily. "You know nothing," he said at last. "You have only pieces, and pieces may be arranged to suit any fancy. You will ruin a name for the sake of a theory." Holmes leaned forward. "A name already ruined by its own conduct requires no assistance from me. But if you wish to save your cousin Lydia from suspicion, for you must know she stands in peril, Then you will tell me the truth." For a long moment the young man stared into the fire. Then, with a sudden motion, he swept the papers toward Holmes. "There, read them, and make of them what you will." Holmes untied the ribbon and examined the first sheet. It was a bill of sale for a shipment of silks from Lyons, signed and sealed with the firm's mark, and beneath, in a bold, unsteady hand, the name of Jonas Barrowby. Holmes's brows rose as he read. "Forged," he said quietly, "and done well, by a hand that knew the genuine signature intimately." "By mine, you mean?" Raymond said bitterly. "Yes, I forged it, but not to rob him, to protect him. He had been deceived by his clerk, Penhaligon, who had misused the firm's accounts for speculation. I meant to cover the loss, to repay it before it was discovered. But he found the bill, accused me of theft, and swore to disinherit me. That night he sent for Penhaligon to confront him. The next morning he was dead." I could not keep back a cry. "Then you believe Penhaligon killed him?" Barrowby's lips twisted. "Who else? He had the chance, the motive, the knowledge, and the following day he drew out £200 from the firm's account and vanished for a week." Holmes listened without expression, but I knew him too well to be deceived. There was a flicker of interest behind those pale eyes that told me he had seized upon something vital. "Vanished, you say?" he repeated. "Where?" "I know not. He returned claiming illness. But the porter saw him one night near the river, in company with a man wearing," he hesitated, "a long black coat, the same perhaps that your mysterious note-writer delights to mention." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A man in a mourning coat?" Barrowby nodded. "So the porter swore, but what of it? 100 men in London wear such coats." "True," said Holmes softly. "And yet this one has left a trail of shadow from Fetter Lane to Brook Street. I thank you, Mr. Barrowby. You have told me much, though perhaps not in the way you intended." He rose. "Come, Watson." Barrowby sprang up. "You cannot leave me under this cloud." Holmes paused at the door. "My dear sir, clouds are useful things. They show us from where the wind blows." Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, hissing upon the stones. Holmes drew his collar close and hailed a cab. "Where now?" I asked. "To Fetter Lane," he replied. "The game quickens. Lestrade will be there already, and if I am not mistaken, our friend Mr. Penhaligon will soon have an opportunity to explain his own mourning coat." We drove in silence. When at last we reached the familiar street, the lamps burned dimly through the mist, and a small knot of people had gathered near the entrance to Barrowby and Sons. A constable barred the way. "Stand back there! Inspector's orders!" Lestrade himself emerged as we approached, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Holmes, you're just in time," he said grimly. "Another death." "Who?" asked Holmes sharply. "Penhaligon," said Lestrade. "Found in his rooms not 20 minutes ago. Door locked, window open, same smell as before. Bitter almonds." I felt the chill run through me. "Good God, Holmes, the same poison!" Holmes's face hardened. "So the hand strikes again to silence the witness. Watson, we are dealing not with vengeance, but with design." He looked up into the swirling fog, his eyes narrowing. "The man in the mourning coat," he said, "has turned executioner. And until we tear that mask away, none of us, not even Miss Lydia, is safe." That night, long after Lestrade had gone to make his report, Holmes stood by the window of our lodgings, staring out over the rain-slicked street. The lamps below shone like blurred halos through the fog. Without turning, he said quietly, "There will be a third death, Watson, before this game is done, unless I move quickly. The pattern is clear now, but the final piece—" He paused, his voice tightening. "The final piece wears perfume, and writes with her left hand." Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Mourning Coat. Chapter 7th. The Violet Perfume. It was one of those bleak winter mornings when London seems not to wake at all, but merely stir uneasily in its sleep. A wan sun struggled through a veil of cloud, striking a dull sheen from the pavements that the night's sleet had varnished to the color of pewter. I came down to find Holmes still in his dressing gown, seated cross-legged upon the hearth-rug, a little pile of papers on his knee, and the familiar gleam of excitement, that rarest and most dangerous stimulant to his system, in his eyes. He looked up as I entered. "My dear Watson," said he, "the man in the morning coat grows careless. That is the beginning of the end." "You have news?" I asked, pouring myself some coffee. He held up a narrow strip of torn fabric, black, fine-grained, with a faint shimmer that caught the light. "From Penhaligon's window ledge," he said. "Lestrade found it clinging to a splinter of the frame. Do you note the texture?" I examined it. "A woman's veil. Gauze, perhaps?" "Precisely. The same weave that left its pattern in soot upon Barrowby's sill. It bears, too, a faint odor. Smell, Watson." He passed it across, and I detected at once the unmistakable sweetness of violets. "The same perfume!" I exclaimed. "The same," said Holmes, rising and pacing the room with restless energy. "Do you recall how Miss Lydia's glove bore a stain of ink upon the left forefinger? The ink of one who writes much, and with haste. A left-handed writer, Watson, who wears violet perfume. That fact points unerringly to her. Yet I tell you she is not our culprit." I stared. "But the evidence is a masquerade," he interrupted impatiently. "The scent, the veil, the handwriting, all arranged to mimic her. The criminal counts on the world's lazy logic, that if a fact fits neatly, it must be true. No, Watson, these are signs, not of guilt, but of design. Someone wishes us to believe Miss Lydia guilty." He flung himself into his chair and clasped his hands behind his head. "Consider the chain of events. Barrowby dies of poison. Penhaligon follows, both deaths preceded by letters invoking the man in the morning coat. The phrase serves one purpose, to deflect suspicion upon a visible symbol. We are looking, therefore, for a person of cunning, one who operates through intermediaries, who understands fear and scent." I could not forbear a smile. "Scent?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A criminal who manipulates symbols must understand association. Violet perfume is no accident. It is the subtlest of lures, the perfume of innocence, of gentility, used here as a mask." He rose and went to the mantel, where a small glass retort simmered gently over a spirit lamp, within it a sliver of the veil steeped in colorless fluid. Holmes watched it with the expression of a chemist conducting an autopsy upon a lie. "I have extracted the essence," he said. "It is not pure violet at all, but a compound of orris root and heliotrope, a cheaper imitation, common to certain cosmetics imported from France. Now, who in this case deals with French goods?" "The firm itself," I said. "Barrowby and Sons." "Just so. But within that circle, who handles the correspondence, the samples, the scents? Who would have easy access to a French perfume, yet be overlooked by all?" His eyes bored into mine. "Mrs. Dunn, the housekeeper." I gasped. "Good heavens, Holmes! That woman, she is near 60. Age, my dear Watson, is no inoculation against wickedness. Remember Lucretia Borgia's nurse." He smiled faintly at my expression. "You recall her agitation, her defensive manner when we first visited the office? The bitterness of her tone toward Penhaligon? A servant embittered by long servitude is capable of curious loyalties, or resentments." He began to pace again, each word quickening with the measure of his thoughts. "She had keys to the rooms, access to the tea service, perhaps to the ink bottle or the pen. The vial of poison we found could have been taken from the warehouse with ease. And if she feared dismissal or disgrace—" I interrupted. "But what motive could drive her to so dreadful a deed?" Holmes stopped short before the fire. "Affection, Watson, or its darker twin, revenge. Barrowby was a man of cold habits, yet it would not surprise me if the woman had once served him too well, and been cast aside. Old devotion turned sour is the most deadly of all poisons." He took his hat and coat from the peg. "Come, Watson. Lestrade must hear this, though he will understand only half of it." We found the inspector at Fetter Lane, standing gloomily in the rain beside the entrance to Penhaligon's lodgings. His men had finished their work and were preparing to remove the body. Lestrade greeted us with his habitual mixture of suspicion and relief. "Well, Mr. Holmes, another fine mess. A clerk dead in his room, poison on the breath, no sign of entry. What do you make of it?" "That it is murder, again," said Holmes shortly, "and that the murderer stands much nearer to you than you suppose." Lestrade scowled. "You've someone in mind?" "I have," Holmes replied. "Mrs. Dunn." The inspector blinked. "The housekeeper? You're joking?" Holmes's voice was cold. "I never jest in matters of life and death. She had both opportunity and motive. She brewed Mr. Barrowby's tea, the most likely vehicle for the poison. She could have entered Penhaligon's room unchallenged under pretext of inquiry. And she is the only person besides Miss Lydia who habitually wears violet perfume." Lestrade frowned. "Perfume, is it? That's thin evidence." "Evidence, Inspector," Holmes returned, "is like rope. Its strength lies in the strands. I have tested the perfume residue from the veil fragment found at this window. It matches precisely the scent used by Mrs. Dunn, a compound of orris and heliotrope, not true violet. Miss Lydia, by contrast, uses the pure extract." Lestrade's eyes widened despite himself. "You're certain?" Holmes smiled grimly. "I am never certain until the rope hangs its weight, and that is what we shall test tonight." At Holmes's direction, we returned to Barrowby and Sons that evening, Lestrade accompanying us with 2 plain-clothes constables in tow. The office stood silent and dark beneath the drizzle, save for a faint glow at one window, the upper chamber where Mrs. Dunn lodged. Holmes motioned for silence and ascended the stairs, his steps soundless upon the worn boards. At the door he paused, listening. A low murmur came from within, the cadence of a voice speaking softly to itself, then the faint rustle of paper. Holmes nodded to Lestrade. The inspector turned the handle and thrust the door wide. The old woman stood at the desk, a candle beside her, a small bundle of documents in her hand. Her face, when she turned, was a mask of terror. Upon the table lay an open box, the same rosewood casket we had found in the safe, and beside it, a vial identical to the one Holmes had examined. Lestrade stepped forward. "Mrs. Dunn, you'll come with us." She drew herself up, her grey hair wild about her shoulders. "No, sir," she said hoarsely. "You'll not take me alive." With astonishing swiftness, she snatched up the vial and raised it to her lips. Holmes sprang forward, but she was quicker. There was a gasp, a shudder, and she fell heavily to the floor. Lestrade bent over her. "Too late," he muttered. "She's gone." Holmes knelt, examined the lifeless form, and shook his head. "Hydrocyanic acid again. The circle closes." He rose slowly, his expression grave. "You see, Lestrade, what comes of crime built upon wounded pride. She killed Barrowby out of jealousy. He had promised her security and cast her aside. Penhaligon she slew because he suspected. And now, when exposure came, she took her own life. Tragic, but inevitable." Lestrade sighed. "You're a cold man, Mr. Holmes. I'll not pretend to follow all your reasoning, but the Yard will thank you." Holmes inclined his head. "Truth, Inspector, is rarely warm." We returned to Baker Street near midnight. Holmes was silent all the way, and even when we reached our sitting-room he did not light his pipe, but stood instead by the window, gazing into the rain-slick dark. At length he spoke. "There is something unsatisfactory, Watson. Something too neat. I never like a case that ends upon confession, whether from the living or the dead. Our adversary has written a conclusion for us. I fear it may be fiction. You doubt her guilt? I doubt her solitude in guilt." He turned toward me, and his eyes had the faraway gleam I knew so well. "There is another hand behind hers, subtler, colder, still at large. The woman was but the instrument. The player remains unseen." He drew from his pocket the fragment of the black veil and held it to the lamp. The weave, the dust, the scent, all true. Yet it was not Mrs. Dunn who wore this veil when it brushed the window. She was heavy of step, her hands rough with labor. This fabric bears the trace of silk, brushed against by kid gloves. He looked up sharply. "No, Watson. The curtain has fallen, but the play is not done. The man in the mourning coat yet walks the stage, and until I unmask him, no one who has touched this case may rest easy." Thus ended what the public came to regard as the conclusion of the Barrowby affair. But to Holmes, and to me, who had learned to trust the uneasy instincts of that extraordinary mind, it was only the darkened intermission before the final act. Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Mourning Coat. Chapter 8. The Midnight Watcher. It was 2 nights after Mrs. Dunn's death, and Baker Street had settled into that peculiar stillness that falls upon London in the hour before dawn, when the last cab has vanished, and even the policemen walk with muffled tread. Yet within the walls of 221B no such peace prevailed. Holmes was pacing the floor like a restless panther, his dressing-gown trailing behind him, his face pale with the light of thought. I had grown accustomed over the years to these vigils, those long sleepless nights in which his brain seemed to burn too fiercely for the world's ordinary rhythm. Still, I confess that this particular night filled me with a sense of disquiet I could not shake. Perhaps it was the fog that pressed against the window-panes, thick and yellow as candle-grease, or the faint echo of the church bell from Marylebone striking 3. Holmes paused at last before the fire, drew deeply from his pipe, and turned to me. "Watson," said he, "do you recall the term overplayed hand I used concerning our adversary?" "I do indeed," I replied. "You suggested that whoever orchestrated these crimes would reveal himself through his excess of cleverness." "Precisely," he said. "And now, the overplaying begins." He crossed to the table and held up a freshly delivered envelope, its seal unbroken. "This arrived by special messenger not an hour ago. The handwriting, you will note, is identical to that of the earlier anonymous letters. But the wording is more personal." He handed it to me. I broke the seal and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you meddle where wiser men would walk blind. There are those who mourn sincerely, and those who wear mourning only as a disguise. Tonight, if you watch the house in Fetter Lane from the opposite side, you will see what the dead see, come alone or not at all." "The Mourning Coat." I looked up, startled. "A trap, Holmes." "Undoubtedly," he said calmly. "And the bait is knowledge, the one lure I have never yet resisted. You mean to go?" "Of course." I sprang to my feet. "Then you shall not go alone." Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, I counted upon that." At 11:30 that night we found ourselves once more in the fog-bound precincts of Fetter Lane. The street was deserted, save for the distant glimmer of a constable's lantern and the whisper of drizzle upon the cobbles. Holmes had donned a heavy overcoat and carried not his usual walking cane, but a short, stout cudgel. I, for my part, had my service revolver beneath my cloak. We took up position in a narrow alcove opposite the shuttered windows of Barrowby and Sons. The faint light of a single gas lamp threw a wavering circle upon the fog, within which the door and windows stood ghostly and distorted. For nearly an hour we waited in silence. From time to time Holmes raised his glass to his eyes and studied the blank facade opposite, but otherwise he remained motionless. My own nerves were strung to breaking point. Once or twice I thought I heard the soft tread of footsteps, but the fog swallowed all sound before I could be sure. Then, shortly before midnight, Holmes touched my arm. "There," he whispered. At first I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I discerned a shape, tall, cloaked, and unmistakably dressed in black. The figure moved with stealth, gliding through the mist until it reached the steps of the warehouse. There it paused, glanced once over its shoulder, and then, with the easy familiarity of one long accustomed to the place, drew a key from its pocket and slipped inside. "The man in the mourning coat," I breathed. Holmes's eyes flashed. "And we are about to learn whether his mourning be genuine or assumed. Come." We crossed the street swiftly and noiselessly. The door was still ajar. Holmes pushed it gently, and we entered. The darkness within was absolute. Holmes took a dark lantern from his pocket and shaded it with his hand, throwing a narrow beam across the floor. The inner office door was open. A light, dim and flickering, came from within. We crept forward, each step upon the board seeming to echo through the silence like a drumbeat. The sight that met our eyes as we reached the threshold froze us both. At the desk where Jonas Barrowby had died sat Raymond Barrowby himself, his face white as chalk, his hand clutching the very ledger Holmes had rescued from the safe. His eyes were fixed upon the open window, through which the fog drifted like pale smoke. Holmes raised the lantern. "Mr. Raymond Barrowby," said he quietly, "this is an odd hour for bookkeeping." The young man started violently, leaping to his feet. "Holmes, what are you doing?" "Here. Returning the compliment, sir. I might ask the same of you." Barrowby's gaze darted wildly from Holmes to me, then to the window. "I received a note," he said hoarsely. "A warning that someone meant to destroy these papers. I came to protect them." "Indeed." Holmes's tone was icy. "The same handwriting, perhaps, as that which summoned me." Barrowby hesitated. Yes, I suppose it must be the same hand." "Then you and I have been lured by the same puppet master," Holmes said softly. "But to what purpose? That is the question." He moved closer to the desk, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "You will permit me?" Before Barrowby could reply, Holmes seized the ledger and held it to the light. "Ah, as I expected, a new entry, written within the last hour." He read aloud, "Paid in full, the debt of silence." Holmes turned the book toward him. "Your hand, Mr. Barrowby." The man's composure broke. "No, I swear it." "Then whose?" Holmes demanded. But before Barrowby could answer, there came a sound that froze us all, the faint scrape of a shoe upon the stair. Holmes's head snapped round. "Out!" he whispered. "To the shadows!" We slipped behind the tall cabinet by the wall just as the door opened once more. A figure entered, smaller, cloaked, the face obscured by a heavy veil. In its hand gleamed a small vial. Raymond Barrowby cried out, "Who are you?" The figure did not speak. It moved forward, swiftly, purposefully. Barrowby retreated, knocking over the chair behind him. The vial was raised, and in that instant Holmes was upon the intruder. There was a sharp struggle, a cry, and the veil was torn away. A pale face was revealed in the lantern's light, the face of Miss Lydia Barrowby. I uttered an involuntary exclamation. Holmes stepped back, breathing hard. "Miss Barrowby," said he, "this is a dangerous hour for experiment." Her eyes blazed. "You do not understand. He murdered my uncle, and now he would destroy every trace that proves it. Let me go, Holmes. Let me end it." Holmes's hand shot out, wrenching the vial from her grasp. "Poison again. So this is what you meant by where only truth can follow. You intended to become judge and executioner both." She turned upon Raymond, trembling. "He forged the letters. He planned the fraud. He poisoned my uncle to hide his crime." Raymond stared at her, aghast. "Lydia, you are mad." Holmes's gaze flicked between them. "No, Miss Barrowby is not mad, only desperate. She has stumbled upon part of the truth, but not the whole." He turned the vial in his hand thoughtfully. "This is not the poison that killed your uncle, Miss Barrowby. It is water tinted with ink. A theatrical prop, perhaps, left to mislead the observer. Someone provided it to you knowing you would come here tonight." She stared at him in disbelief. "Then who?" Before she could finish, a shadow fell across the doorway. A voice, cold and precise, spoke from the gloom. "I did." We turned. There, framed against the mist beyond the threshold, stood a tall man clad from head to foot in black, a mourning coat buttoned to the throat, a cravat of jet silk, a face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Holmes drew a sharp breath. "At last," he murmured. "The man in the mourning coat." The intruder stepped forward, and the faint light caught the features of his face. It was not the face of Raymond, nor of any we had yet seen. Thin, hawk-like, with eyes that glowed like coals. In his gloved hand he held a small pistol, the barrel steady as a surgeon's scalpel. Holmes's voice was low but unshaken. "You are punctual, sir. I have expected you these 3 days." The man's lips curved into a mirthless smile. "Then you know why I am here." "To silence the living, as you have silenced the dead." "To complete a task," the stranger said evenly. "And to ensure that no one leaves this room who remembers the name of Jonas Barrowby." The gun moved slightly, covering all 3 of us. Holmes's eyes, sharp as razors, flicked once toward me, a signal I knew well. "Watson," he said softly. "The lamp." I swung the dark lantern full open. The beam blazed across the intruder's eyes. There was a shout, a flash, and the crack of a pistol shot. The glass of the window shattered. In the confusion, Holmes leapt forward, and I saw the 2 men grapple in the swirl of fog that poured through the broken pane. Then the stranger wrenched free, bounded through the window, and vanished into the night. Holmes sprang after him to the sill, but halted. "No use," he said between breaths. "He knows the alleys better than the police." He turned back to us, his face pale, but his eyes afire. "We have seen him, Watson. Flesh and blood, not spectre nor myth. The man in the mourning coat walks among us, and by the grace of Providence he has shown his hand too soon." He looked down at Miss Lydia, who had sunk trembling into the chair. "Take her home, Watson. She is more sinned against than sinning. As for me, I have business in the fog." "But Holmes—" He held up a hand. "No questions. Only faith. By dawn we shall know the meaning of all this." And before I could speak, he was gone, swallowed by the mist that had birthed our shadowed adversary. Thus ended that fearful night in Fetter Lane. As I led the shaken Miss Lydia out into the empty streets, the echoes of the struggle still seemed to whisper in the fog, "You will see what the dead see." And I knew that somewhere in the labyrinth of London, Sherlock Holmes was already closing his net around the ghostly figure whose black coat had left death in its wake. Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Mourning Coat. Chapter 9. The Trap at St. Martin's Wharf. The events that followed the apparition of that dark figure remain among the most vivid of my recollections. The night air rent by the crack of a pistol, the crash of glass, and the fading echo of retreating footsteps swallowed by the fog. Yet it was not fear that gripped me then, but a chill foreboding. For though Holmes had faced many desperate villains in our time together, never had I seen one whose menace was so ghost-like, nor whose mind, perhaps, so near the equal of his own. When I returned to Baker Street in the grey light of dawn, I found the sitting-room as I might have expected, a litter of maps, telegraph forms, and the faint scent of damp fog clinging to the curtains. Holmes sat at the table, a cup of untouched coffee before him, his lean fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes hollowed by fatigue, yet glittering with inner fire, lifted as I entered. Watson," he said quietly. "You return from escorting Miss Lydia?" "She is safe," I replied. Though shaken beyond measure, she swore she had never seen that man before. "I believe her," said Holmes. "She is an unwitting piece in a game whose board was laid years before her birth." He rose and began pacing before the hearth, his dressing gown flaring behind him like the wings of some restless bird. "Our adversary," he continued, "is no common criminal. He is a mind of singular refinement, methodical, patient, and entirely without conscience. He has employed fear as his ally, death as his signature, and disguise as his shield." "And yet," I said, "you speak of him as though you knew him." Holmes stopped abruptly, his keen gaze fixed upon me. "I do, Watson. Or rather, I knew him, long ago before ever I took up my present calling." He turned toward the fire and for a moment stood silent, the flames painting strange shadows upon his face. When he spoke again, it was in a lower tone, as though half to himself. "There was once a chemist named Sebastian Kavanagh, a brilliant student of toxicology, expelled from the university for illicit experimentation. He disappeared, and it was said he died in the East. But death, as you and I know too well, is an elastic term in London. 3 years later, a certain Mr. Jonas Barrowby took into his employ a foreign clerk, a man of reserved habits but extraordinary knowledge of chemicals. His name was never recorded, but the handwriting upon the old invoices, I have compared it, is that of Sebastian Kavanagh. I started. Then Kavanagh, this man in the mourning coat, is one and the same, said Holmes gravely. Barrowby dismissed him, suspecting theft. The dismissal ruined him. He reappears now to destroy all who wronged him, first Barrowby, then Penhaligon, and at last Raymond. Each death carefully staged to conceal the truth, yet proclaim his presence. He revels in the poetry of vengeance. I was silent for a moment, awed by the breadth of the scheme. But why reveal himself to you? Holmes smiled thinly. Vanity, my dear Watson. The desire to prove himself against the one mind he fears. He has sent his challenge. I intend to answer it. He drew from his pocket a slip of paper, a telegram stamped Tilbury Docks, St. Martin's Wharf, and handed it to me. Shipment, silks from Lyons, to be collected this night, 11 p.m., J. Barrowby and Sons. You perceive the irony, he said. The dead firm still receives shipments under its name. That warehouse, Watson, is Kavanagh's final stage. There he will come to destroy the last evidence of his fraud, and perhaps to end the career of one Sherlock Holmes. I protested at once. You cannot go alone. I shall not, he said, smiling faintly. Indeed, I shall require both your revolver and your excellent nerves. Lestrade, too, will be in attendance, though he must remain unseen until the right moment. I intend to set a little snare for our mourning gentleman, baited with the one thing he cannot resist. And that is? Knowledge, said Holmes simply. I shall give him what he craves most, the illusion of victory. That night was one of those when the fog lies low upon the Thames, turning the river into a ribbon of ghostly silver, and the ships into blurred hulks looming out of nothingness. St. Martin's Wharf lay at the end of a narrow causeway, its timbers slick with dew, its warehouse standing dark against the water. The air smelt of tar, wet rope, and the faint sickly sweetness of decaying cargo. Lestrade and his men waited in the shadows beyond the quay, while Holmes and I concealed ourselves within the warehouse itself, behind a stack of crates labelled Lyons Silks. A single lamp burned upon the desk near the far window, and beside it Holmes had arranged the recovered ledger, the forged invoices, and a decanter half filled with wine. The stage is set, he whispered. Our actor will not resist so perfect a tableau. How can you be sure he will come? I asked. Holmes smiled. Because I have invited him. He drew from his pocket a folded sheet, a copy of the note we had received, but altered in his own hand. To the man in the mourning coat, the final debt awaits you at St. Martin's Wharf. Come alone. The ledger is open. I sent it by the same messenger who brought his first letter, said Holmes. He will not suspect. We had not long to wait. At 11 precisely, a faint sound reached us through the fog, the rhythmic dip of oars. Holmes extinguished the lamp and drew me deeper into shadow. Presently a small boat loomed from the darkness and bumped gently against the wharf. A tall figure stepped ashore. Even in the dim light I could see the gleam of his coat, black as pitch, glistening with mist. He moved like one who knew every inch of the place, crossed to the warehouse door, and entered without hesitation. For a moment he stood in the gloom, listening. Then he struck a match, lit the lamp upon the desk, and his face, that pale hawk-like visage, sprang into view. Holmes's whisper reached me. Patience, Watson. Let him begin his work. The man seated himself at the desk, drew the ledger toward him, and began turning the pages rapidly. His gloved fingers trembled, not with fear, but eagerness. I saw him take from his pocket a small vial and a folded paper, the implements, no doubt, of his dreadful art. He poured a few drops of the liquid upon the page and watched as the ink dissolved beneath it. So, murmured Holmes under his breath, he destroys his own record. Excellent. I could bear the tension no longer. Holmes, I whispered. "If you mean to act." He raised a hand. "Wait." The man worked swiftly. Then, as he reached for the decanter Holmes had placed, he froze. A smile flickered across his lips. Cruel, knowing. He lifted the glass to his nose, sniffed, and laughed softly. "You overestimate yourself, Mr. Holmes," he said aloud. "I do not drink with the dead." Holmes stepped from the shadows. "Then perhaps you will parley with the living." The man in the morning coat did not start. He turned slowly, and his cold eyes met Holmes's across the lamplight. "So it is true," he said. "The legend of Baker Street has a pulse after all." "I bleed, sir, but not easily," Holmes replied. "And I do not die in the company of cowards." The man inclined his head. "A duel of words, then. Very well. You have followed me admirably, from poison to forgery, from servant to master. But you have missed the heart of the matter." "Enlighten me," said Holmes. "I am no murderer, Mr. Holmes," the man said quietly. "I am an avenger. Jonas Barrowby ruined me, stole my invention, my formula for a chemical process that could have changed the industry. He cast me into ruin and claimed my work as his own. I swore that the name of Barrowby should rot. And it has." Holmes's expression hardened. "You might have appealed to the law." The man's laugh was short and bitter. "The law? The law of men who dine with merchants and despise the poor scholar? No, Mr. Holmes. Only death could balance that ledger." Holmes took a step closer. "And Penhaligon? What debt had he incurred?" "He discovered my secret and would have betrayed me. The same price for all who stand in my path." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the faint lapping of the river outside. Then Holmes said quietly, "And Miss Lydia Barrowby? Does your vengeance demand her life as well?" For the first time the man faltered. She was innocent. Yet you used her, her perfume, her handwriting, her very name. You sought to ruin her, to make her your mask." The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "She bears the face of the woman I loved, the daughter of the man who destroyed me. I could not kill her." Holmes's eyes blazed. "And yet you would have killed all around her to feed your obsession. You are a chemist, sir, a maker of formulas, but there is no formula for peace." At that instant the sound of boots echoed from the wharf. The man's head snapped up. "Your friends from Scotland Yard, I presume?" Holmes's reply was a single word. "Yes." The murderer's face twisted in fury. With a swift motion he hurled the vial into the lamp. There was a flare of blue flame, a rush of acrid smoke, and in the confusion he sprang through the open window toward the river. Holmes dashed after him, but by the time we reached the quay, only ripples remained where the dark waters swallowed their prey. Lestrade's voice came panting from behind. "Gone?" Holmes stood looking down into the black current. "Gone," he said softly, "and the river keeps its own secrets." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes threw himself into his chair and covered his face with his hands. "It is a poor ending, Watson. Poetic, perhaps, but poor. He deserved the rope, not the river." "Yet London is safer for his fall," I said. He looked up at me, weary and grave. "Safer, yes, but poorer too. A brilliant mind perverted by pride. That is the most tragic death of all." He rose, went to the window, and drew aside the curtain. Outside the fog had lifted, and the first pale light of morning lay over the city. "The man in the morning coat is gone," he murmured, "and with him, perhaps, something of my own reflection." Thus ended the case of the man in the morning coat, though its shadow lingered long in our minds. For many months afterward, whenever the fog rolled in from the river and the lamps shone dim through the vapor, I would see again that tall figure fading into the mist, and hear Holmes's quiet words echoing in my memory. "There is no vengeance clever enough to outwit the conscience, and no disguise dark enough to conceal the truth." Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Morning Coat. Chapter X. The Woman Who Watched from the Fog. In all our adventures together, few cases left Holmes in a mood of such prolonged disquiet as did that of the Man in the Morning Coat. Weeks passed after the grim episode at St. Martin's Wharf, and yet my friend remained uncharacteristically silent and withdrawn, avoiding both his violin and his chemical table, and gazing for long intervals into the fire with that fixed, abstracted stare I knew too well. It was not the first time I had seen him suffer that reaction to success. For Holmes, the thrill of the chase was all. Once the quarry fell, some vital flame within him seemed to gutter out. But in this instance there was something more, a tension unresolved, a note left hanging in the air. I began to suspect, with growing unease, that the affair had not reached its true conclusion. It was upon a damp February afternoon, when a light snow fell sluggishly upon Baker Street, that the curtain began to rise again. I had been absent at my practice, and returned to find Holmes seated at the window, the morning paper spread upon his knee. His eyes were not upon it, however, but fixed upon the street below, where a small hansom had drawn up before the door. He turned as I entered. "Watson," said he, "our visitor brings the scent of violets." The words struck me with instant foreboding. "Miss Lydia Barrowby?" Holmes nodded. "You will remember she has been under Lestrade's supervision since the night at St. Martin's Wharf. Yet she comes alone. That fact alone is instructive." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered our visitor into the room. Time and grief had changed her. Her face was pale, but the former shadow of fear had given way to a kind of solemn calm. She carried a small parcel in her gloved hands. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "forgive this intrusion. I should not have troubled you again, but something has come into my possession that has unsettled me greatly." Holmes rose, bowed slightly, and motioned her to a chair. "You do me honor by coming, Miss Barrowby. I have not yet ceased to think of your case. What has occurred?" She unwrapped the parcel with trembling fingers. Within lay a small glass phial, empty but for a few crystals at the bottom, and a folded sheet of paper, its edges still damp from the snow. "This was brought to my lodging this morning," she said. "It was left upon the window-sill. The servant found it at dawn. I recognized the handwriting at once." Holmes took the paper, unfolded it carefully, and read aloud, "To the last of the Barrowbys. The river does not always keep what it is given. You will see me once more when the fog returns. The Mourning Coat." Holmes laid it down with deliberate calm, but his eyes burned like embers beneath half-lowered lids. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The hand is the same, though more tremulous, written perhaps by one recovering from illness or exposure." Miss Lydia's voice trembled. "Then it is true? He lives?" Holmes regarded her steadily. "The Thames swallows many and yields a few, Miss Barrowby. It would appear that our adversary belongs to the latter class." She shuddered. "What am I to do, Mr. Holmes? This letter speaks of me. Of us. I thought it finished." Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. "So thought I. But rivers, Miss Barrowby, are poor jailers. Their cells have too many doors. Tell me, have you noticed anyone following you? Any unfamiliar figure near your lodgings?" She hesitated. "Yes, twice this week. A man in black standing near the corner by the lamp-post. I thought him a mourner from some funeral passing nearby. He vanished when I looked again." Holmes rose and began to pace, his mind clearly racing. "A theatrical soul to the end," he said softly. "He cannot resist the pageantry of fear. But the letter gives us what he would hide, the where and the when. He says, 'When the fog returns.' We shall turn his stage against him." He turned sharply to her. "Miss Barrowby, I must ask for courage once more. You will serve as the bait in our trap." Her eyes widened, yet to her credit she did not flinch. "If it will end this horror, I will do as you ask." "Good," said Holmes. "Then tomorrow evening, when the fog is forecast to roll up from the river, you shall drive to your uncle's old office in Fetter Lane. You will enter by the front, light the lamp, and remain within for 10 minutes. Watson and I will be near, and every exit will be watched. If our man approaches, he will reveal himself." That evening found Holmes more animated than I had seen him in weeks. His preparations were meticulous. He arranged with Lestrade for plainclothesmen to be stationed in every alley near Fetter Lane. A second team watched the river approaches. "He will come," Holmes said, "not because he must, but because he cannot not. The compulsion of the dramatist drives him. He must complete his play." The following night the fog returned as if summoned by Holmes's will. It drifted low and heavy, muffling sound, swallowing the lamps until each shone like a dying star. From our vantage across the street, Holmes and I watched Miss Lydia's cab draw up before the familiar door. She alighted, composed yet pale, and disappeared within. For 10 minutes all was silence. Then Holmes's hand tightened upon my arm. "Do you hear that?" Through the smothering fog came the soft crunch of footsteps. A tall shape moved slowly along the opposite pavement, the unmistakable silhouette of a man in a long black coat. He paused at the door of Barrowby and Sons, looked up at the window, and slipped inside without a sound. Holmes whispered, "Now!" We darted across the street, revolvers drawn. The door yielded easily, too easily. Within, the lamp burned low, the room empty. Miss Lydia's cloak lay draped across a chair, but of the lady herself there was no sign. Holmes struck a match, scanning the floor. No struggle, no forced entry. She went willingly. He moved to the inner office, bent suddenly, and held the match close to the ground. "Ah, Watson, note this. A trail of damp footprints, small, feminine, leading to the rear door, and beside them a larger print, the sole cut in the pattern of a continental boot. They go together." "Then she is in his power," I exclaimed. "For the moment. But he will not harm her. Yet. He craves audience for his final act. Come." We followed the prints through the narrow passage to the back entrance, and thence into the swirling fog of the alley beyond. A faint gleam of light glimmered ahead, the reflection of a lantern swinging in the mist. We moved cautiously toward it, keeping to the shadows. At length we emerged upon the riverbank near Blackfriars, where the water lapped sullenly against the stone embankment. There, beneath the arch of a disused warehouse, stood the two figures, Miss Lydia, her hands clasped before her, and the man in the mourning coat. His hat was removed, his dark hair streaked with grey, his face ghastly pale but resolute. "You should not have come," he was saying. "I meant you no harm, Lydia." "You left me no peace," she answered, her voice trembling. "Why torment the living for the sins of the dead?" "The sins of the dead live on in their heirs," he said harshly. "Your uncle stole from me what was mine by right. He ruined my name. I have restored the balance." "By murder?" He flinched as though struck. "Justice, not murder. You cannot understand." "I understand that vengeance has consumed you," she said quietly, "and that no river will wash your hands clean." The man's shoulders sagged. "Perhaps not, but tonight it shall wash me away once more." He took a step toward the river. At that instant Holmes's voice rang out behind him. "Stay where you are, Kavanagh." The figure turned sharply. "Holmes, so you keep your promises. I should have known." "Your play is ended," Holmes said calmly. "Drop the pistol and step away from the lady." The man's laugh was low and hollow. "You think this is a play, Holmes? It was never that. It is an equation. Action, consequence, dissolution. And I am merely the final term." He raised the pistol, but not at us. Before either of us could move, he turned it upon himself. There was a flash, a report swallowed instantly by the fog, and the man in the mourning coat fell backward into the black water with scarcely a splash. Holmes sprang forward, but the current took him at once. We watched helplessly as the last trace of that dark figure vanished beneath the tide. Later, in the warmth of Baker Street, Miss Lydia sat wrapped in a shawl before the fire, her face pale but composed. Holmes stood at the window, staring out into the mist that still drifted past the lamps. "It is over," I said softly. Holmes shook his head. "Over, perhaps, for him, but never for the city that breeds such men." Kavanagh was both criminal and victim of pride, of genius unrecognized, of the cold machinery of commerce. There are thousands like him, Watson, walking these streets in silence. Some will be redeemed, Others will wear mourning coats." He turned, his gaze resting on Miss Lydia with unexpected gentleness. "For your part, madam, the past is buried now. Let it remain so." She rose and offered her hand. "You have given me back my peace, Mr. Holmes. I can never thank you enough." When she had gone, Holmes sank into his chair and lit his pipe. The thin smoke curled upward like a ghost above the flame. "Strange, Watson," he murmured, "how the most brilliant minds so often burn themselves out in the service of folly. I sometimes think that if I were ever to lose the discipline of my art, I might not be far behind our friend Kavanagh." I protested warmly, but he only smiled, that weary, enigmatic smile that seemed to hold both irony and pity for all mankind. And as I looked upon him in the flickering firelight, I thought I saw for an instant the shadow of a dark figure standing behind his chair, the outline of a man in a mourning coat, watching still from the fog that pressed against the windows of Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes and the man in the mourning coat. Chapter the Find, the return of the fog. It is one of the peculiarities of London that even peace, when it comes, carries a tinge of melancholy. The great city does not so much rest as brood. Its silence is the pause of a beast between movements. And so it was in the weeks that followed the affair of the man in the mourning coat. Miss Lydia Barrowby had retired from the city to distant relatives in the north. Raymond had, by Holmes's intervention, been spared the worst consequences of his folly, and departed for the colonies, and Lestrade, whose official report attributed the crimes to the deceased woman Dunn, and one Sebastian Kavanagh, chemist, closed the file with a sigh of satisfaction. Holmes, however, was not satisfied. "I detest conclusions that arrive too neatly wrapped," he remarked one evening as we sat by the fire. "There are too many corners left unexamined." "Surely, Holmes," said I, "the case is ended. The man is dead, the river his tomb. Even the yard is content." Holmes smiled thinly. "The yard is easily contented. But I tell you, Watson, I saw Kavanagh fall, not die. The river is a clever conspirator. It hides much, but confesses nothing." I laughed lightly. "Surely you do not expect him to have survived twice." My friend made no answer, but drew from his pocket a small scrap of paper, folded and sealed with the blue stamp of the Metropolitan Police. "This arrived this morning from Inspector Lestrade," he said, passing it to me. I opened it, and my heart gave a sudden leap as I read. From Thames Division, Metropolitan Police Date, March 3rd, 1893. Report recovery of personal effects, Lower Pool, near Wapping. Description: one black coat of foreign make, lining torn. No body found. In pocket, a small waterproof cylinder containing a sheet of paper inscribed: "There are debts the river cannot pay. I go where the fog is deeper." Signed only with the symbol of a black cross. When I looked up, Holmes was watching me closely. "Well," said he softly, "what say you to that, my dear fellow?" "It could be coincidence," I ventured, though my voice lacked conviction. Holmes shook his head. "No. The symbol of the cross was Kavanagh's mark upon his laboratory flasks. I have seen it with my own eyes in the university records. He lives, or lived long enough to mock us once more." He rose abruptly, and began pacing the room, his dressing gown sweeping behind him. "I tell you, Watson, the man was too clever, too theatrical to die quietly. The pistol shot may have been feigned. The river was deep enough to hide a diver's trick. He had planned every act of his vengeance as though upon a stage. Why not plan his own death scene? You suspect he escaped deliberately. I do more than suspect. The recovered coat proves it. Had the current merely stripped it from his body, the fabric would be sodden and torn. Yet the lining, you note, was cut, not ripped, by a knife. The coat was discarded as a skin is shed. Our mourning coat has been laid aside, but the man within walks free. The thought filled me with unease. "Then what do you propose?" Holmes halted before the fire, his profile outlined in the glow. "To find where the fog thickens most, Kavanagh's letter is more than bravado, it is a map. The fog is his refuge, his element. And where does London's fog lie deepest, Watson? The river, I said. Always the river. Just so. I have instructed Lestrade to make inquiries along the warehouses east of Wapping Reach. There are corners there where a man might vanish as utterly as though into another world. Chemists' lofts, old glassworks, half-flooded cellars. The perfect lair for a ghost who once brewed death in a bottle. The following evening brought confirmation of Holmes's fears. We were dining quietly when a telegram arrived, delivered by a breathless messenger. Holmes tore it open and read aloud, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street. From Inspector Lestrade. Message. Watchman at Old Verney Glassworks, Wapping. Reports break-in last night. Strong smell of chemicals. Found footprints leading to river. No suspect detained. Please attend." Holmes's eyes shone with that peculiar light which to me was half exhilaration, half alarm. "The Verney Glassworks," he cried. "Close these 5 years. Watson, we shall dine upon adventure tonight." We reached Wapping shortly after 10. The fog, which had been thin in the upper streets, grew dense as we descended toward the river. The lamps were pale halos in the gloom, and the smell of tar and salt water mingled with that heavy odor of decay, peculiar to the wharves at Ebb Tite. The Verney Glassworks stood at the end of a deserted lane, its high windows black and broken, its chimney like a finger pointing accusingly at the sky. A watchman met us at the gate, a burly fellow with an oil lamp swinging in his hand. "I found the door open, sir," he said to Lestrade, who had joined us with 2 constables. "Thought it was lads at mischief, but when I went in there was a queer smell, bitter, like almonds." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "Oh, you see, Watson," he murmured, "our chemist rehearses his old experiments." Inside, the air was thick with the stench of gas and chemicals. The floor glittered faintly where fragments of glass caught the lamplight. Holmes moved ahead of us, his lantern sweeping the shadows, until he reached a long workbench littered with bottles, flasks, and papers. Upon one of these papers lay a single black glove. Holmes lifted it with his forceps. "Fresh," he said. "Still damp from the fog outside. He was here within the hour." He turned the page beneath it and drew a sharp breath. "Look." The paper was covered in a fine, neat script, the same hand as the anonymous letters. It was a list of chemical symbols, formulae, and beneath them a single line in English. "A new essence. Death without odor, color, or taste." Holmes's face was grim. "He is working again. God help us, Watson. He is refining his art." Lestrade cursed softly. "The man's a devil, but where has he gone now?" Holmes's eyes darted to the floor. "Here. The footprints, small, precise with a turned heel, the same continental boot as before. They lead to the stair at the far end." We followed the trail up a narrow iron staircase that creaked under our weight. At the top lay a small office overlooking the river. The window stood open, and the fog poured in like smoke. On the sill rested a half-burned candle, and beside it a scrap of paper weighted with a stone. Holmes took it up and read in silence. Then he turned to us, his expression unreadable. "To the master of deduction. Do not mistake absence for defeat. A man may drown in the world and yet breathe beneath it. When next you see the fog rise from the river, remember, it is I who draw the curtain." Lestrade muttered an oath. "He's toying with you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "No, Inspector, he's inviting me." He stood for a long moment at the open window, staring out into the shifting mist where the lights of barges gleamed faintly through the vapor. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost like admiration, he said softly, "Sebastian Kavanagh lives, and he waits." That night, as we drove home through the deserted streets, I could not rid my mind of the vision of that empty room above the river, the half-burned candle, and the words upon the paper. For the first time in all my long acquaintance with Holmes, I saw in his eyes not triumph, nor even curiosity, but something deeper, a flicker of anticipation mingled with unease. He spoke at last. "Watson, There are adversaries one defeats, and adversaries one understands. I fear this man may be both. Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Mourning Coat. Chapter 12. The Shadow over Baker Street. For some weeks after our grim expedition to the Verney Glass Works, a strange calm seemed to settle upon Baker Street, that deceptive quiet which I have come to recognize as the stillness before one of those storms that fate reserves for my friend Sherlock Holmes. Outwardly all was as it had been. The fogs of March drifted thick over London. Hansom cabs splashed through the slush of Marylebone, and Holmes, as ever, sat wrapped in his dressing gown, alternately silent for hours or roused to bursts of feverish activity over some trivial puzzle. Yet beneath that calm exterior I sensed an unease, a tension coiled and waiting. He had spoken little of the Verney episode since that night, but the name Sebastian Kavanagh hung unspoken between us like a spectre. I had caught him more than once standing by the window, watching the street below as though expecting a shadow to detach itself from the fog and knock at our door. One evening, as the lamps burned low and Mrs. Hudson's footfall died away upon the stairs, Holmes turned to me abruptly. "Watson," said he, "I am watched." I started. "Watched, Holmes? By whom?" "By a mind," he answered softly, "that measures my every thought and movement as surely as I measure those of my clients and criminals. The Man in the Mourning Coat has crossed from the realm of the hunted to that of the observer." He crossed to the mantel and drew from the pile of morning correspondence a small, unmarked envelope. "I received this an hour ago," he said, handing it to me. The sheet within bore but a single line, written in the familiar, graceful script that had haunted our case from the beginning. "When intellect mirrors intellect, which reflection breaks first?" There was no signature, no address, no trace of origin beyond the faint perfume of violets. "Violets again," I murmured. Holmes nodded grimly. "He taunts us, Watson. Each of his letters carries a subtle shift in tone. The first threatened, the second mocked, and this one questions. It is as though he seeks not my destruction, but my participation in some infernal duel of minds." "You think him near, then?" "As near as the fog outside that window," Holmes replied. "He has discarded the physical field of battle. His warfare now is psychological." He turned suddenly to the bureau and drew out a map of London. "Observe," he said, spreading it across the table. "These are the sites of his previous appearances. Fetter Lane, St. Martin's Wharf, the Verney Glass Works. Do you perceive the pattern?" I examined the map, but could make little of it. They seemed scattered at random. "Not random, deliberate," said Holmes. "Each forms one point of a triangle, the apex of which lies here." His finger tapped the center of Marylebone, directly over Baker Street. I stared at him in horror. "You mean—" "Yes," he said quietly. "The triangle closes upon us. Kavanagh has turned the pursuit inside out. We are no longer the hunters, but the quarry." For the next several days Holmes moved with a restlessness that bordered on the feverish. He rarely slept, ate little, and paced the room for hours at a time, his eyes ever and again flicking toward the window as though expecting to see that tall, black-coated figure materialize out of the mist. It was upon the fifth night that the next blow fell. I had retired early, but was roused near midnight by a sharp knock upon my chamber door. Holmes stood there, fully dressed, his face pale, but his eyes alive with that cold fire I knew so well. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. "We have work. A messenger from the yard brought this a moment ago." He held up a telegram. "From Lestrade. Explosion and fire at Verney Glass Works. Watchman killed. Barrel of chemicals recovered bearing initials SC. Suspect sightings reported in Bloomsbury district. Proceeding to investigate." Holmes crushed the telegram in his hand. He moves again. The fire was a message. The initials a calling card. "Kavanagh is drawing closer." I followed him downstairs, and within minutes we were speeding through the fog in a cab bound for Bloomsbury. The city lay silent under its shroud. the gas lamps burning dimly through the haze like the dying embers of a great fire. "Where are we bound exactly?" I asked. "To the source of our own shadow," Holmes replied cryptically. "If my deductions are correct, Kavanagh will not come for me by night with gun or knife. No, Watson, he will strike at the very citadel of my mind." I could make little of this remark, and before I could press him further, the cab drew up before a narrow lane off Great Russell Street. Holmes alighted, lantern in hand, and motioned me to follow. The passage was silent and deserted, lined with shuttered shops and warehouses. At its end stood a low building with a single dim light burning behind a curtain. Holmes approached, and with a single rap of his cane, struck upon the door. There was no answer, only the faint creak of a hinge. The door had been left ajar. We entered. The room within was small and bare, save for a table littered with retorts, bottles, and a single open notebook. Upon the wall hung a black coat, long, gleaming, unmistakable. Holmes crossed to it and laid a hand upon the fabric. "Still damp," he said softly. "He has been here within the hour." He turned his attention to the notebook. The pages were filled with chemical formulae, interspersed with fragments of prose. "To silence perception is to rule it. When thought ceases, obedience begins. The gas expands unseen." Holmes read rapidly, then drew in his breath. "Watson, do you see? He is no longer content with poison in a vial. He means to create a vapor, something that acts through the lungs, unseen, instantaneous." I shuddered. "A weapon?" "A weapon, yes, but also a demonstration. He means to show me that intellect can govern death as easily as life. He will unleash his experiment where it will wound me most, here in Baker Street." Holmes closed the notebook and slipped it into his pocket. "Come, we must return at once." It was near 2 in the morning when we reached home. The fog had thickened to a milky pall through which the lamps burned like dim coals. As Holmes fitted the key into the door, he paused suddenly, sniffing the air. "Do you smell that, Watson?" I caught it then, a faint, sweet odor, oddly familiar. "Violets," I said. Holmes's face hardened. "He has been here." We rushed upstairs. The door of our sitting room stood open, the lamp within turned low. On the table lay a single envelope, and beside it our old friend's violin bow, snapped clean in two. Holmes tore open the letter. "The experiment begins. I shall see how long genius breathes when the air itself turns traitor." Even as he read, I felt a prickling in my throat, a bitterness, faint but unmistakable. Holmes's eyes widened. "Out, Watson! Out, quickly!" We stumbled into the corridor as he flung open the window with a crash. A pale vapor curled upward from the floor, catching the light with a ghostly shimmer. The unmistakable scent of almonds followed it. Holmes dashed for the chemical cabinet, seized a flask of ammonia, and smashed it upon the hearth. "The vapor is heavier than air," he shouted. "It sinks. Keep low." We crouched upon the landing as the acrid fumes filled the room, neutralizing the invisible poison. After what felt like an eternity, Holmes rose, coughing but alive. He turned to me, his face drawn but triumphant. "You see, Watson, he is here, in London. He has turned my home into his laboratory. The duel is joined in earnest." He looked toward the open window, where the fog drifted in like a living thing. "The shadow has crossed our threshold. Now it must be driven out." That night, as dawn broke pale and cold over Baker Street, Holmes sat motionless by the window, his revolver on the table beside him and the broken violin bow in his lap. "The man in the mourning coat has declared war," he said quietly. "And I, for once, am no longer the hunter, but the hunted." Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Mourning Coat. Chapter 3. The Duel of Minds. It is no easy task for me, even now, to record the events of those dreadful days when Sherlock Holmes found himself the target of a mind so cold, so brilliant, and so relentlessly calculating as that of Sebastian Kavanagh, the man in the mourning coat. Never in all our long acquaintance had I seen my friend so harried, so sleepless, nor so humanly vulnerable. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and London itself, with its gaslit streets, its veiled alleys, its innumerable hiding places, had turned into a chessboard upon which two intellects maneuvered for survival. The poisoned air that night in Baker Street had been the first move. Holmes's quick action with the ammonia saved us both, yet the knowledge that our sanctuary had been violated was like venom in his mind. For 2 days thereafter, he did not stir from the room, pacing like a caged thing and speaking little, save for those abrupt flashes of reasoning that were his substitute for rest. "Observe, Watson," he said on the second morning, standing before the open window as the mist drifted in from the street. "He has shown me his method, an odorless gas heavier than air, the last refinement of hydrocyanic acid. He wished to teach me humility through fear. But humility, my dear fellow, is a lesson I learned long ago. What he has truly taught me is how he thinks." "And how is that, Holmes?" I asked. "As a dramatist," he answered, "every act with him is theatre. He must be seen, or rather, he must see himself being seen. It is not enough for him to triumph. He must hear the applause of his own imagination. That vanity, Watson, is the loose stone in his fortress. I shall strike it." He crossed to his desk, where lay the remnants of the anonymous notes we had received. "There are, in total, 7 letters," he said, "each delivered by hand, each written upon paper of identical make. But see here. The watermark is reversed in 3 of them. Such reversal occurs only when the sheet is cut from the end of a ream. Those 3 were written elsewhere than the rest, on a different stock, perhaps purchased at another time. I have traced the watermark to a certain stationer in Red Lion Square. We shall begin there." We found the shop at the corner of a narrow court, a dim little place smelling of dust and sealing wax. A clerk, pale and spectacled, came forward with the timid eagerness of one unused to visitors. "Pardon me," said Holmes, showing him one of the letters. "This paper, Bignon Frères of Lyons. You stock it, I think." The man nodded. "Indeed, sir. A fine foreign article, though few in London can afford it. Do you recall selling any of this to a gentleman within the past fortnight? A tall man, perhaps foreign, in morning dress?" The clerk frowned, searching his memory. "Why, yes, sir. A week ago Tuesday. Came near closing time. Bought half a ream and a bottle of violet-scented gum. Paid cash." Holmes inclined his head. "You observed nothing else? His voice? His hands?" "A gloved hand, sir. And his voice? Low, soft, like one used to teaching." "Excellent," said Holmes. "And the address he gave?" The man shook his head. "None, sir. But he left a card upon the counter. I took it for a whim, but I kept it." He opened a drawer and produced a small rectangle of heavy paper. Upon it, in black ink, was drawn a simple symbol, a cross within a circle. Holmes's face darkened. "Kavanagh's mark," he murmured. "He leaves it like a signature upon the world." He took the card. "Watson, we have our line. Come." We walked the short distance to Red Lion Square and stood for a time in its center, the fog drifting between the gaunt, shuttered buildings. Holmes's eyes roved slowly from window to window, then upward to the dark chimneys against the sky. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" he said at last. "He is here." "Here?" I echoed. Holmes pointed to a tall, narrow house at the square's northern side. A faint light glimmered behind the upper curtains. "The stationer's card was not a taunt but an invitation. He expects me to follow it to its source. He believes I cannot resist the lure of his pattern. And he is right. But we shall alter the end of his play." "Do you mean to enter?" I asked, my heart sinking. He smiled slightly. "It would be discourteous not to." The door was unlatched. We climbed a narrow stair whose boards creaked underfoot, each step swallowed by the heavy silence that lay over the place. At the landing above, a door stood ajar, and through the gap came the faint scent of violets mingled with something acrid and metallic. Holmes pushed it open. The room beyond was large, lit by the glow of a single gas jet. The walls were lined with shelves of chemical apparatus, retorts, jars, glass tubing, all gleaming faintly in the half-light. At the center stood a table upon which rested a small mechanical device of curious design, a cylinder of brass with a network of pipes and valves leading to a glass globe filled with pale vapor. Behind it, his face illuminated by the ghostly light of his own invention, stood Sebastian Kavanagh. He was no longer the lean figure of the wharf, but gaunter, his cheeks hollow, his eyes burning with an unnatural brightness. The black mourning coat hung upon him like a shroud. "So," he said quietly, "the inevitable visitor. You never could resist an unfinished puzzle, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped forward. "And you, Kavanagh, could never resist an audience. You have gone to great trouble to summon me." The man's thin lips curved in a smile. "Summon? No, my dear Holmes. To complete you. You and I are of one kind. You hunt minds. I create them. You disassemble patterns. I weave them. We are both enslaved to intellect, and intellect, when pure, demands a final test." Holmes's gaze flicked to the device. "And that test is murder?" Kavanagh's eyes glowed. "Not murder. Revelation. This apparatus will release a vapor that silences the brain's will, leaving thought suspended between life and death. A clean oblivion, my masterpiece. And you, Holmes, shall be its witness." Holmes's voice was steady, almost cold. "And what of the others you have already destroyed? Barrowby, Penhaligon Dunn, were they your witnesses too?" "They were impediments, notes in a discordant chord," the man said softly. "But you are harmony itself." He reached for the valve. In that instant Holmes moved. There was a blur of motion, a crash, and the hiss of escaping gas. I fired blindly, glass shattered, and the room filled with a choking cloud. Holmes's voice rang through it. "To the window, Watson!" We staggered toward the faint square of light, gasping for air. Behind us came a strangled cry, a thud, and then silence. Holmes flung open the sash, and the cold night rushed in, sweeping the fumes aside. When the air cleared, we turned back. The apparatus lay in ruins upon the floor, and beside it, Sebastian Kavanagh, the man in the mourning coat, his face ashen, his hand outstretched toward the broken globe. A faint smile lingered upon his lips. He breathed his own invention. Holmes said quietly. The irony would have pleased him. I knelt beside the body. "He is gone," I said. Holmes stood for a moment looking down at him, the lamplight glinting upon his gaunt features. "Yes," he murmured, "and with him goes a mind that might have served mankind had it but known mercy." He turned to me. "Watson, open the window wider. Let the fog take him. It is, after all, his only fitting grave." We left that house as the first light of dawn crept over the roofs of Red Lion Square. Holmes spoke little on the way home. When at last we reached Baker Street, he seated himself in his chair and stared long into the dying fire. "It was a duel of minds," he said at length, "and in such duels there are no victors. Each blade cuts both ways." He looked up at me then, and in his grey eyes I saw a weariness deeper than any I had known in him before. "The man in the mourning coat is dead, Watson," he said softly, "but I sometimes wonder which of us was truly the mourner." Sherlock Holmes and the Man in the Mourning Coat. Chapter 14. The Final Reflection. It is not often in the course of my long companionship with Sherlock Holmes that I have seen him visibly moved by the outcome of a case. He was, by habit and temperament, the most self-contained of men, a mind that dissected rather than felt, and whose triumphs, however brilliant, seldom found expression beyond the faint upward curve of a lip or a spark in those keen grey eyes. But after the death of Sebastian Kavanagh, the man whom London had come to whisper of as the man in the mourning coat, I observed a change in my friend that both troubled and fascinated me. He was not broken, nor even shaken, but subdued, as though a long echoing chord within him had been struck, and now vibrated still. For the first time in our acquaintance, Holmes had confronted not a mere criminal intellect, but his own reflection, darkened, distorted, and ultimately destroyed by its own brilliance. The morning after that fearful night in Red Lion Square, I found him sitting by the fire, a cup of coffee cooling beside him, the early light struggling through the fog outside. He had slept, I think, not at all. Upon the table lay Kavanagh's notebook, the final testament of the chemist's diseased genius, its pages dense with formulae and notes in a fine, exact hand. Holmes was turning them over slowly, almost reverently, as a scholar might study a rare manuscript. Without looking up, he said quietly, "Watson, I have destroyed men before, through logic, through law, through evidence as cold and sharp as steel, but never before have I destroyed one who mirrored myself so perfectly." I took the seat opposite him. "You speak of him as though he were your brother. In intellect," he said, "he was. In morality, most never." He looked up then, and the faintest shadow of a smile crossed his features. "Yet intellect divorced from morality is merely a sharper knife in the hands of a child. He sought to prove that reason could master death, and in doing so he became its servant." He closed the notebook and handed it to me. "There, my dear fellow, lies the most dangerous substance I have ever encountered. Not the formulae, they are ingenious but incomplete, but the idea they represent, that knowledge alone justifies itself. If that creed ever gains ground, mankind will poison itself faster than any chemist could contrive." Toward noon, Inspector Lestrade arrived, grey and damp from the fog. He was more deferential than usual, and his voice, when he spoke, lacked its customary brisk assurance. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, "we've made a tidy close of it this time. The Yard's satisfied. There's not a trace left of the fellow's work. The papers are sealed, and the body's at St. Pancras. The coroner's calling it accidental death. Gas explosion." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "The word accident, Inspector, is merely man's apology to fate." Lestrade coughed awkwardly. "Aye, well, between ourselves, you've done London a service. The Commissioner means to say as much. Good day to you, Mr. Holmes. Doctor." When he had gone, Holmes smiled faintly. "Poor Lestrade. He sees the corpse, but not the ghost. To him, Kavanagh is finished. But there are minds like his, brilliant, bitter, rootless, scattered through the world even now, and each one, given the right despair, might one day don the same black coat." He rose and stood at the window. Outside, the fog was lifting, the sunlight diffused through it in pale gold. For a long moment he watched it in silence. "Do you recall what he said, Watson? When intellect mirrors intellect, which reflection breaks first? I have thought much upon that. The answer, I think, is neither. Each cracks the other. The mirror remains, but the image is changed." "You blame yourself," I said gently. "Not blame. Recognition. There is a precipice that separates genius from madness, and I have walked closer to its edge than is comfortable. Were it not for—" He stopped, then said simply, "For friendship, I might have followed him." That evening, Holmes took up his violin for the first time since the beginning of the affair. The first notes were tentative, groping, like a man speaking again after a long illness. But gradually the tone deepened and steadied, until the room seemed filled with a strange, haunting beauty. The melody was one I had never heard before, minor in key, yet with moments of such sudden, crystalline tenderness that my eyes stung as I listened. When the final note died away, I could not speak. Holmes set the instrument aside and looked toward the fire. "I have composed an elegy, Watson," said he softly, "not for Kavanagh alone, but for all who lose themselves in the labyrinth of intellect. Genius, like light, casts long shadows." In the weeks that followed, London resumed its vast, indifferent rhythm. The newspapers made passing mention of the explosion in Red Lion Square, but the name of Sebastian Kavanagh never appeared. Only Holmes and I, and perhaps Miss Lydia, to whom Holmes sent a brief letter assuring her safety, knew the true scope of the tragedy. Spring came, the fogs thinned, The trees along Baker Street budded into fragile green, and once more the hansoms rattled cheerfully past our window. Yet sometimes, when the dusk gathered and the lamplighter's torch flared outside, I would see Holmes's gaze drift toward the hearth, where the broken violin bow still rested upon the mantelpiece, preserved, he told me, as a memento of imperfection. He spoke little of the case thereafter. Only once, as we sat together late one night with the fire burning low, did he refer to it again. "Watson," he said suddenly, "have you ever reflected that the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not by law but by mercy? Kavanagh crossed it without knowing. I have seen the edge too clearly ever to forget it. Let us both hope that, should such a moment come again, we are found upon the gentler side." He rose, smiled faintly, and stirred the fire with the poker. "And now," he added, "bring your revolver, my dear fellow. I have just received a telegram from the continent. Something about a missing sapphire in Prague. After all, the world does not pause for philosophy." I laughed, as I always did when the old energy returned to him, and followed him out into the cool night air. Yet even as we stepped into the waiting cab, I could not help glancing once more at the mantelpiece, at the violin bow, at the faint trace of black powder on the hearth, at the place where shadow and firelight met, and in that instant I could have sworn that a wisp of fog, pale and ghostly, drifted for a moment across the room and was gone. Postscript. Months later, on a still summer evening, as I sat alone in Baker Street, for Holmes was abroad on a case, I opened the drawer of his desk in search of a pencil, and found beneath a sheaf of papers a small envelope sealed in black wax. Upon it, in Holmes's hand, was written only, "To be opened by Dr. John H. Watson in the event of my death." I stared at it for a long time, and then replaced it, unopened, in its resting place. For I knew that, so long as Sherlock Holmes lived, death itself would find little peace in the fogs of London. Thus ended The Man in the Mourning Coat, a tale not merely of crime, but of intellect turned inward upon itself, a mirror shattered and mended in equal measure. And if ever again, in the still hours of night, I catch the faint scent of violets upon the air, I shall think not of evil, but of genius, fragile, perilous, and forever walking the narrow path between shadow and light,